You're watching the Everything Network.
Frank Gusengerg was an American contract killer and a victim of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. Born in Lakeview, Chicago, he was the second oldest of three sons and one daughter born to Peter Gusengerg Sr. Peter Sr. was a first-generation emigrant from Gusenberg, a municipality in today's Trier-Saarburg district in Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany. The Gusenbergs lived at 434 Roscoe Street in Lakeview. In 1901, when Frank was 8 years old, his elder brother, Peter, found their mother dead in the kitchen of their home. After their mother's death, the boys were raised by their father, who was largely absent due to work. With little parental supervision, Frank and his elder brother Peter began committing petty crimes with Bugs Moran. Frank was first arrested for disorderly conduct in 1909. In 1911, he was convicted of disorderly conduct and sent to the notorious Bridewell Prison in South Lawndale, Chicago. After his release, the two brothers and Bugs Moran began committing more serious crimes. Between 1909 and 1914, Frank was a suspect in numerous armed robberies and burglaries in the Chicago area. The Gusengerg brothers and Bugs Moran then joined Dean O'Banion's Northside Gang. They became two of the gang's chief hitmen. After O'Banion was murdered in November 1924, most likely by the Chicago outfit, the Gusengerg brothers joined Jaime Weiss in getting revenge on the Capone-Torrio organization. In 1926, however, Gusengerg was brought up on burglary charges by the state prosecuting attorney's office. For unknown reasons, the charges were never filed. In his personal life, it was said that Frank Gusengerg was a bigamist. He was married to two women simultaneously, Lucille and Ruth, both of whom were unaware of the other. Frank Gusengerg participated in the gargantuan drive-by shooting on the North Side, performed on Capone's headquarters, the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, Illinois, riddling it with hundreds of bullets on September 20th, 1926. According to many accounts, the second-to-last car stopped in front of the hotel restaurant where Capone was cowering, and Gusenberg's brother, Pete, emerged, clad in a khaki army shirt, brown overalls, and carrying a Thompson submachine gun fitted with a 100-round capacity drum. Kneeling in front of the doorway, Frank emptied the entire drum into the restaurant, and then casually strolled back to his car, which then sped off to safety. The attack worked. Capone was very shaken and requested a sit-down. However, it failed to deliver. Jaime Weiss was murdered 3 weeks later, and over the next couple of years, the North Side Gang continued to weaken. The North Siders especially wished to kill Jack McGurn, as he was rumored to have been the machine gunner who killed Weiss. On at least 2 occasions, the Gusengerg brothers made attempts on his life. Despite receiving several wounds, McGurn survived these attempts. Also around this time, Al Capone had Pasquale Patsy Lolordo installed as head of the influential fraternal organization Unione Siciliani. By late 1928, the leader of the North Side Gang, Bugs Moran, struck an alliance with Al Capone's rival Joe Aiello. The latter, assisted by the Gusengerg brothers, killed Antonio Lombardo and Pasqualino Lolordo, presidents of the Union. It was as a result of these murders that Capone plotted to eliminate Bugs Moran. On February 14, 1929, members of the North Side Gang gathered at a garage behind the offices of SMC Cartage Company. Inside were Pete and Frank Gusengerg, Albert Weinshank, Adam Heyer, James Clark, John May, and Reinhard Schwimmer. The last 2 men, May and Schwimmer, were not actually gang members. 5 men, possibly members of Capone's gang, possibly outside hired guns, most likely a combination of the two, drove to the garage in a stolen police car. 2 of the men, dressed as police, entered the garage, pretending they were conducting an ordinary raid, and lined Moran's associates up against the wall. Once the men's backs were all turned, facing the wall, 2 other men with civilian clothes entered the room with machine guns and, along with the fake policemen, opened fire on the 7 men, firing 70 bullets into them, in what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. When the real police arrived at the scene, Gusengerg was the only victim still alive despite having been shot 14 times. Reports erroneously list 22 times. Among the police was Sergeant Clarence Sweeney, who had grown up in the same neighborhood as the Gusengerg brothers and immediately recognized Frank. Sweeney asked Frank, "Who shot you?" Frank, observing the gangland principle of omerta, absolute silence, replied, "Nobody shot me." Frank was then taken to the hospital, where he was once again asked by Sweeney who shot him. He again refused to answer. His last words reportedly were, "I ain't no copper." Frank Gusengerg died of his wounds 3 hours after being shot. The Gusengerg brothers were initially buried in Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago's North Side. They were later reinterred at Irving Park Cemetery. Joe Aiello was born on September 27, 1890, in Bulgaria, Sicily, to Father Carlo Sr. He was part of a large and impoverished family of at least 9 other brothers and many cousins. His mother died when he was a child. In July 1907, at the age of 17, Joe immigrated to the United States to join family members already residing there. After arriving in New York City by boat, he worked a series of menial jobs in Buffalo and Utica, New York, before connecting with his father, brothers, and cousins in Chicago. The family set up several businesses in both New York and Chicago, including the financially successful Aiello Brothers Bakery, and they become importers of such groceries as olive oil, cheeses, and sugar. Joe was the co-owner of a cheese importing business with a fellow Sicilian, Antonio "Tony the Scourge" Lombardo, an ally of organized crime figure Al Capone. Aiello was president of the company, which was called Antonio Lombardo and Company. Al Capone was said to have lent both men $100,000 to start the enterprise. With the enactment of Prohibition and the start of bootlegging, the sugar import business brought Aiello into contact with organized crime, along with his brothers Dominic, Antonio, Andrew, and Carlo. In Chicago, they made a small fortune selling sugar and other home-cooked alcohol components to the Genna crime family, and Aiello earned enough money to buy a 3-story mansion in Rogers Park. However, he craved recognition and prestige in addition to money, something he was gaining as he was becoming known as the top organized crime boss of Chicago. When the Genna family lost power in Chicago following gang wars, the Aiellos believed themselves the successors of their territory. In November of 1925, Lombardo was named head of the Unione Siciliana, a Sicilian-American benevolent society that had been corrupted by gangsters. An infuriated Joe Aiello, who had wanted the position himself, believed Al Capone was responsible for Lombardo's ascension, and he resented the non-Sicilians' attempts to manipulate affairs within the Unione. Aiello severed all personal and business ties with Lombardo and entered into a feud with him and Capone, essentially ending a Chicago gang peace treaty that had been in force since the 1926 murder of Capone rival Jaime Weiss. Aiello allied himself with several other Capone enemies, including Dean O'Banion and the trio of Billy Skidmore, Barney Birch, and Jack Zuda, who ran vice and gambling houses together, although they became less receptive to Aiello after Capone personally approached and threatened Skidmore. While newspapers falsely reported that Joe Aiello had also entered into an active alliance with George Bugs Moran and his North Side gang at this time, Moran in fact pledged no specific support to Aiello until later, and instead privately supported Aiello from the sidelines without actively participating. Aiello plotted to eliminate both Lombardo and Capone, and starting in the spring of 1927, made several attempts to assassinate Capone. On one occasion, he offered money to the chef of Joseph Diamond Joe Esposito's Bella Napoli Cafe, Al's favorite restaurant, to put prussic acid in Capone's and Lombardo's soup. Reports indicated he offered between $10,000 and $35,000. Instead, the chef exposed the plot to Capone, who who responded by dispatching men to destroy one of Aiello's stores on West Division Street with machine gun fire. More than 200 bullets were fired into the Aiello brothers' bakery on May 28, 1927, injuring Joe's brother Antonio. During the summer and autumn of 1927, a number of hitmen Aiello hired to unalive the Chicago boss were themselves slain. Among them were Anthony Russo and Vincent Spicuzza, each of whom had been offered $25,000 by Aiello to kill Capone and Lombardo. Aiello eventually offered a $50,000 reward to anyone who eliminated Capone. At least 10 gunmen tried to collect on Aiello's bounty, but ended up dead. Capone ally Ralph Sheldon attempted to kill both Capone and Lombardo for Aiello's reward, but Capone henchman Frank Nitty's intelligence network learned of the transaction and had Sheldon shot in front of a West Side hotel, although he didn't die. In November 1927, Aiello organized machine gun ambushes across from Lombardo's home and a cigar store frequented by Capone. But those plans were foiled after an anonymous tip led police to raid several addresses and arrest Milwaukee gunman Angelo Lamantio and 4 other Aiello gunmen. After the police discovered receipts for the apartments in Lamantio's pockets, he confessed that Aiello had hired him to kill Capone and Lombardo, leading the police to arrest Aiello himself and bring him to the South Clark Street police station. Upon learning of the arrest, Capone dispatched nearly 24 gunmen to stand guard outside the station and await Aiello's release. The men made no attempt to conceal their purpose there, and reporters and photographers rushed to the scene to observe Aiello's expected murder. Capone gunmen Frank Perry, Sam Marcus, and Louis Little New York Campagna were arrested as they tried to enter the front of the station and placed in the cell next to Aiello, who Campagna told, "You're dead, friend, dead. You won't get up to the end of the street still walking." Aiello pleaded for mercy and promised to sell his possessions and leave Chicago with his family if they let him go, but Campagna refused the request. When released, Aiello was given a police escort out of the station to safety. He later failed to make a court appearance after his attorney claimed he suffered a nervous breakdown. Aiello disappeared with some family members to Trenton, New Jersey, from whence he continued his campaign against Capone and Lombardo. Aiello's brother Dominic returned to Chicago in January 1928 to attend to family matters while his brother remained in New Jersey. One day, he received a telephone call warning him to leave town, after which the Aiello brothers' bakery was shot up by gunmen. Aiello briefly allied himself with former Capone employer and friend Frankie Yale, meeting with him regularly in New York City and plotting Capone's overthrow, until Yale himself was murdered. Aiello was said to have fled to Wisconsin under the protection of the Milwaukee crime family, and also briefly took refuge in Buffalo with his ally there, crime family boss Stefano Magaddino. With Joe Aiello still in hiding, Al started targeting his men and killed several over the next few years, including his brother Dominic. Aiello returned to Chicago in the summer of 1928 and once again approached Moran, whose relationship with Capone had degenerated even further, making him much more receptive to an active alliance with Aiello. They conspired to eliminate Lombardo, a task they assigned to hitmen Frank Tight Lips and Peter Gusengerg. Lombardo was shot to death on a busy Chicago street on September 7, 1928, and although never arrested, at least one of the Gusengerg brothers is believed to have been among the shooters. After Lombardo's death, Aiello attempted to elevate his ally Peter Rizito to the Unione Siciliana position, but Rizito was killed by shotgun blasts outside his home. Joe Aiello was also believed to have masterminded the murder of Pasqualino Patsy Lolordo, Lombardo's successor as head of the Unione, who was killed in his home on January 8, 1929. Police alleged that Aiello suggested a truce with Lolordo, and when Lolordo invited Aiello into his home for a toast of friendship, Aiello and 2 others shot him to death. When police later questioned Lolordo's widow, she screamed when she was shown a photo of Aiello, but refused to explain why she was afraid and would not answer questions about him. Capone retaliated against Moran by organizing the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a hit that wiped out the Gusengerg brothers, decimated Moran's forces, and resulted in the loss of a significant amount of Aiello's support. Shortly afterwards, Aiello persuaded Capone killers Albert Anselmi and John Scalise to betray their employer and convince Joseph Hop-Toad Junta, the new head of the Unione Siciliana, to support Aiello in eliminating the UFIT boss and taking control of the north side of Chicago following the departure of Bugs Moran. However, Al learned of Aiello's plot in April 1929 and had all three men eliminated. The violent retaliation against Aiello indirectly led him to finally become head of the Unione. During a conference in Atlantic City, numerous mob bosses supported Aiello's promotion with the hopes of restoring order in Chicago, and Al Capone apparently accepted the decision, at least temporarily. Retired Chicago mob boss Johnny Torrio was said to have mediated a peace agreement among Al Capone, Joe Aiello, and Bugs Moran, in which they agreed to end the gang warfare and murders. However, Aiello's accession coincided with Capone serving a year in prison for carrying a concealed weapon, which Aiello saw as an opportunity to take control of some of Capone's territory and scheme yet again for his assassination. Aiello gained a measure of nationwide notoriety around this time after ranking 7th on Chicago Crime Commission Chairman Frank J. Loesch's Public Enemies list, released in April 1930, which identified the top 28 people he saw as corrupting Chicago. Through his mafia boss allies Magaddino and Gaspar Milazzo, Aiello arranged a meeting with Joe Masseria, the Capo di Tutti Capi based in New York City, seeking support in Aiello's efforts against Capone. During the meeting, Masseria offered to support Aiello in exchange for control of the east side of Chicago, which would allow Aiello to keep the city's west side. The offer infuriated Aiello, who threatened Masseria and ordered him to leave the city. In turn, Masseria spread false rumors that Aiello attempted to kill him, giving him a pretext to support Capone in retaliation. Mafioso Joseph Bonanno later described as a key incident in starting the Castellamarese War in New York City. Masseria openly supported Al, requiring a strong alliance with him following the death of Masseria ally Giuseppe Morello. He also offered territory to Milazzo if he betrayed Aiello, an offer Milazzo rebuffed and considered insulting. As a result, Aiello backed Salvatore Maranzano in the Castellamarese War, providing the Maranzano forces with $5,000 a week for their war chest. During the early months of 1930, Aiello arranged several unsuccessful assassination attempts against outfit bodyguards, including Jack McGurn, Phil D'Andrea, and Rocco DeGrazia. Aiello hoped to leave the Chicago boss vulnerable by depleting his security, and Capone began to suspect Aiello had spies within the Chicago outfit because he seemed to have inside knowledge about where his targets would be and when. In August 1930, 2 months before Aiello's death, the state's attorney conducted a raid on Aiello's home, obtaining records as part of a series of raids by the United States government to fight against gangland activities in Chicago. After the ambush, the 2 apparent shooters ran from the buildings and fled in a Ford sedan. The car was later discovered to have been set on fire and destroyed. Aiello's body was loaded into the taxicab and taken to Garfield Park Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The coroner eventually removed 59 bullets, weighing over a pound, from the body. He was shot more times than any single victim of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. A third machine gun position, which was ultimately not used, was later discovered by police in another nearby building, which had been rented a week before the murder by a man who gave the name Lon Celespe. Police, prosecutors, and federal agents immediately and publicly speculated that Capone was behind the assassination, noting that the precision machine gun ambush was typical of his attacks. Prestigiacomo, fearful for his life, went into hiding for 3 days after Aiello's death before turning himself in to police. He was charged as an accessory before the fact of Aiello's murder, a charge also filed against John Source, an employee of Aiello's importing company. Detectives questioned whether Prestigiacomo provided Aiello's enemies with information about his whereabouts, something he vehemently denied. Police claimed Prestigiacomo was not cooperative and lied about his relationship with Aiello. The charges against Prestigiacomo went to a grand jury, but were ultimately dropped. Frank Nitti was also wanted by police for questioning in connection with the murder. Some historians later suggested mafia forces outside Chicago may have been behind the hit as part of the Castellamarese War, but Virgil Peterson, an expert on Chicago organized crime, believed the murder was strictly related to city gang warfare. Aiello's family ordered an $11,000 coffin for him. Before eventually being placed in Riverside Cemetery in Rochester, New York, Aiello was originally buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Chicago on October 29, 1930, close to former friend-turned-rival Lombardo. Al continued to hunt down Aiello's allies even after his death. 1 month after Aiello was killed, police discovered an abandoned machine gun nest manned by alleged Capone gangsters in a house opposite the home of 4 of Aiello's former henchmen. Aiello's nephew, Frank Aiello Jr., was fatally shot through a window while he was playing cards in his Milwaukee home on May 23, 1931. Authorities believed the killing was related to the Chicago feud, despite Frank's apparent lack of ties to organized crime. Aiello's death left Al effectively unchallenged in his control over Chicago, and brought 70 years of peace to the city in terms of the Chicago outfit leadership. Aiello was believed to have been responsible for the deaths of at least 24 people throughout his life, according to the Chicago Tribune, which described him as the toughest gangster in Chicago and one of the toughest in the country. The year of Morello's emigration to the United States is not certain. Author Mike Dash writes that Morello emigrated in 1892 after becoming a suspect in a murder in Corleone and after his counterfeiting ring had been compromised. Despite his departure, the Italian government brought a case to court and found him guilty of money counterfeiting. On September 14, 1894, he was sentenced to 6 years and 45 days imprisonment, plus a fine, and deprived of the right to hold public office. It is possible that the sentence was handed down in absentia. According to Critchley, it appears that Morello left Sicily for New York around this time. His 3 half-brothers Niccolò, Vincenzo, and Ciro, his stepfather Bernardo, his mother Angelina, his sister Maria, his half-sister Rosalia, his wife Maria Rosa Marsalisi, and son Calogero would arrive in New York City on March 8, 1893. In the mid-1890s, Giuseppe Morello moved to Louisiana in search for employment and was joined by the other members of the Morello-Terranova family. The following year, they moved to Texas and farmed cotton. After contracting malaria, they returned to New York around 1897. Morello tried his hand in different business ventures, including failed investments in a saloon and a date factory. His first wife, Maria Rosa Marsalisi, died in 1898 in Corleone. In 1902, he acquired a saloon at 8 Prince Street in Manhattan, which was to become a meeting place for members of his gang. In December of 1903, Giuseppe married Niccolina Lena Salimi, who stayed with him for the rest of his life. In the 1890s, he founded the 107th Street Mob, which would later evolve into the Morello crime family. In 1903, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, the Sicilian mafia boss in Little Italy, Manhattan, married Morello's half-sister Salvatrice. Morello built his empire based on his merciless ordering of death sentences against everyone who dared to face him. Lupo, his main enforcer, was responsible for more than 40 murders in a 10-year period. The Morello crime family would frequently employ the notorious barrel murder system, dumping dismembered corpses into large wood barrels. The barrels would then be thrown into the sea, left on a random street corner, abandoned in a back alley, or shipped to non-existent addresses in another city. Family businesses included extortion, loan sharking, Italian lottery, robbery, and counterfeiting. Illegally earned money was then legitimized by legal businesses such as stores or restaurants owned by the family, making them the first crime family in town to organize this kind of money laundering. They also introduced revolutionary ways of extorting small amounts of money every week from business owners in exchange for protection, as opposed to the theft of large amounts, which might bankrupt them. This technique was adopted from Black Hand gangsters, and it led to increased profits for the gang. Two members of Morello's crime family, who became captains under him, and who later gained much prominence in the New York underworld, were Giuseppe Morello and Salvatore d'Aquila. By 1905, Morello had created the largest, most influential Sicilian crime family in New York City and was recognized as boss of bosses by mafia leaders in the United States, according to Nicola Gentili. Morello was found guilty of counterfeiting again in 1910 and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was later paroled. In 1922, President Warren Harding freed Morello from the constraints of his parole by granting a conditional commutation of sentence. The youngest of his three half-brothers, Niccolo Terranova, took over control until 1916, when he was killed by the Neapolitan boss in Brooklyn, Pellegrino Morano, as well as Tony Peretti as part of the Mafia Camorra War. Morello's remaining two half-brothers, Vincenzo Terranova and Ciro Terranova, took over as boss and underboss and ran the family until Morello's release from prison. Newly released from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1920 and trying to retake control of his empire, Morello found himself considered a threat to his former captain, now turned mafia boss, Salvatore d'Aquila, who, within a year of Morello's release, ordered Morello killed. He, along with a number of others now under orders of death by d'Aquila, fled to Sicily. One of these men, a former d'Aquila gunman, Umberto Valenti, went after Morello and his chief protector and ally, Giuseppe Morello, in order to regain the favor. A war ensued, and, after much violence and some prominent deaths among the mafiosi involved, Valenti was killed by Morello gunmen, some say including or solely Charles Luciano, in August 1922. With Valenti gone, d'Aquila's power began to lose its luster of invulnerability. Morello, sensing his time to rule had passed and the power of Morello was on the rise, became consigliere to Morello and prospered under him throughout the Prohibition years of the 1920s. During the Castellamarese War between 1930 and 1931, Morello and Morello fought against a rival group based in Brooklyn, led by Salvatore Maranzano and Joseph Bonanno. Morello, an old hand at killing, became Morello's war chief and strategic advisor. One of the first victims of the war was Giuseppe Morello, who was killed along with associate Joseph Periano on August 15, 1930, while collecting cash receipts in his East Harlem office. Joseph Valachi, the first made man in the American Mafia to turn state's evidence, identified Morello's killer as a Castellamarese gunman by the name of Buster. In the early part of the 20th century, New York had 5 Sicilian crime families. With the imprisonment of powerful Sicilian mafia boss Giuseppe Morello in 1910, Salvatore d'Aquila, one of Morello's chief captains, immediately emerged as the new chief mafia power in New York City, mostly in East Harlem and Little Italy in southern Manhattan, but he also led a faction in Brooklyn that was headed locally by Al Mineo. D'Aquila had assumed the title from Morello of Boss of Bosses. D'Aquila's family, along with Mineo's Brooklyn faction, reigned supreme through the 1910s. However, upon the advent of Prohibition, other mafia crime families and also non-mafia operations began to gain power and influence and cemented their positions around the city. One of these crime families was the former Morello crime family, which had been taken over by Joe Masseria around 1920. Former boss Giuseppe Morello was released from prison approximately the same time and quickly aligned himself with Joe Masseria against boss Toto di Aquila and his underbosses, including Al Mineo. Manfredi Mineo would continue his rise within the New York Mafia and eventually become di Aquila's second-in-command or underboss of all his operations, while still leading his own family in Brooklyn as a di Aquila faction. As rivalries and animosity grew between the di Aquila and Masseria families, Mineo would eventually find himself in a precarious position. Di Aquila had previously sentenced Morello to death upon his release from prison, along with his ally Umberto Valenti, but through the gentle intervention of Pittsburgh Mafia leader Nicola Genti, the death sentence on Morello and Valenti was revoked. With Valenti now in his debt, Di Aquila used this opportunity to recruit the feared mafia leader in order to oppose the new Masseria-Morello alliance. Al Mineo faced the chance of losing power and influence within the Di Aquila crime family to Valenti, but in 1922 Valenti was murdered by Masseria-Morello forces. By the mid-1920s, Mineo and his top lieutenant Steve Ferrigno began to assess their position within the Di Aquila organization, and understood at this time that the new power in New York was Joe Masseria. So Mineo secretly began to align himself with Masseria. On October 10, 1928, while standing next to his car, Di Aquila was murdered by gunmen. Mineo, who had recently aligned himself with boss Joe Masseria, more than likely played a direct role in planning the murder of his boss. After declaring his allegiance to Masseria and showing his distorted loyalty by betraying his former boss, Mineo's place atop the Di Aquila crime family leadership was cemented. He had secured his Brooklyn interests and would now command one of the larger Manhattan-based mafia groups in New York. With Ferrigno as his second-in-command based in the Bronx, the Mineo crime family would control a number of rackets: bootlegging, gambling, numbers, and extortion. Strong rivalries continued between various New York Mafia crime families and factions, the most heated rivalry being the one between Mineo's Manhattan-based allies in the Masseria crime family and those in the Brooklyn-based Castellamarese clan, a group of mafiosi from the Sicilian seaside town of Castellammare del Golfo, who rose to prominence during Prohibition and would become extremely independent and eventually oppose the dominance of boss Joe Masseria and his supporters, such as Mineo. The rivalries and animosities between the two groups would eventually come to a head, and a war within the Italian underworld would erupt and drag every mafia crime family and faction in New York into the conflict. What became known as the Castellamarese War began in early 1930 and dragged on for the better part of 2 years, as New York Mafia leaders Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano fought for dominance over the New York rackets. Mineo felt secure being aligned with Joe Masseria, who led the most powerful New York Mafia crime family and was recognized as the most influential crime boss in the city. The Masseria-Mineo alliance quickly gained the upper hand in the war, as their forces began to move on Castellamarese-controlled territories and rackets members, eliminating rivals at every opportunity. But on August 15, 1930, the tide began to change when Masseria's top advisor and war chief, Giuseppe Morello, was killed. Mineo was named Joe the Boss's new war chief and strategist, and quickly surmised that the Castellamarese were gaining more support and more ground as the war dragged on. Mineo felt the only solution was to find and kill Maranzano before he could kill Masseria, this being the only sensible solution to ending the war and re-establishing dominance over the New York Mafia. On November 5, 1930, Mineo and his lieutenant Stefano Ferrigno were murdered in the courtyard of an apartment building on Pelham Parkway in the Bronx. Earlier in the week, several Maranzano gunmen had rented a first-floor apartment in the building. Their actual target was Masseria, who had been observed entering the building earlier in the week. However, When the gunmen saw Mineo and Ferrigno in the garden, they seized the opportunity and shot both of them from the apartment window. After Mineo's death, Frank became crime family boss. He immediately switched allegiance from Masseria to Maranzano, who was emerging as the winner in the gang war. It has been theorized that Scalise had arranged a secret deal with Maranzano to kill Mineo and become the organization boss, but Maranzano forces were able to eliminate Mineo without Frank's help. John Factor, widely known as Jake the Barber Factor, was a Prohibition-era gangster and con artist affiliated with the Chicago outfit. He was born Yakov Faktorowicz on October 8, 1892 in Łódź, Congress, Poland, to Avram Abraham Yakov Faktorowicz and his wife, Leah. His father was a rabbi, and he had one sibling, a sister, Dina. His family left Poland before the Bolshevik Revolution and refused to register for citizenship in Stalin's USSR, thus forfeiting their Russian citizenship and leaving them stateless. Like his more famous older half-brother, Max Factor, he had trained at an early age in hair care, which led to his mob nickname Jake the Barber. The family emigrated to the United States in 1906. They joined his elder brother, Nathan, in St. Louis, Missouri. John perpetrated a massive stock fraud in England in 1926 that netted $1 million. Some of his victims were members of the British royal family. He subsequently fled to Monaco and executed another major scam, rigging the tables at the Monte Carlo casino and breaking the bank. He then returned to the United States. While in the United States, he was tried and sentenced in absentia in England to 24 years in prison. He fought extradition all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which heard oral argument on April 18, 1933. Factor's son, Jerome, was kidnapped the same day, and some believe this was staged. 8 days later, John himself and several members of the Chicago outfit, with whom he was associated, saw Jerome in a car. They gave chase and freed him, while the kidnappers got away. Again, some believe this was staged. As Factor was trying to free his son, the Supreme Court held the case over for re-argument. Some claim that, fearing he would lose the case, John had himself kidnapped on June 30th of 1933. He reappeared on July 12th, and his family claimed they had given the kidnappers a $50,000 ransom. The FBI believed Jerome's kidnapping was genuine, and that the pending extradition made Factor avoid contact with law enforcement. They believe this avoidance was the reason Towie chose him as the second kidnap victim. This time, however, the kidnapping was reported and had to be investigated. When found, Factor had been burned and beaten. Some also claim John was working closely with the Chicago outfit and framed local Irish mob boss and Chicago outfit enemy Roger Towie for the kidnapping. Roger was tried for the kidnapping. The jury in the first trial was dismissed before reaching a verdict. The second jury convicted him, and he lost his case on appeal. On his release from jail, Towie published a book claiming the kidnappings were faked and he had been jailed unjustly. Factor sued him, his publisher, his printer, and his ghostwriter. The case was dismissed because Factor was discovered to have been a stateless person when he filed the case, and thus unable to sue. John lost his extradition battle when the Supreme Court held in John Factor versus Laubenheimer that he should be turned over to British authorities. He was taken into custody on April 17, 1934. On June 27, 1934, Factor's wife, Rella, then asked a U.S. federal district court to dismiss the extradition on the grounds that Factor had been held for longer than the 2 months permitted for extradition proceedings under U.S. law. The United States Secretary of State, acting on a request by local law enforcement, intervened in the case, asking the court to release Factor because he might be needed as a witness in further legal proceedings against Towie. The Secretary of State declined to exercise his discretion under the law to toll the case. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ordered John Factor released and extradition proceedings. He was convicted of mail fraud in 1942 and served 6 years of a 10-year sentence. In 1955, Factor took over the running of the Stardust Hotel on the Las Vegas Strip, allegedly as a frontman for the Chicago outfit. He sold the hotel for $7 million in either 1962 or 1963. It is alleged that when John ran the casino, it made between $50 to $200 million. He was also involved in an attempt to bail out Jimmy Hoffa from his real estate-related financial problems. John became politically and philanthropically active and was the largest donor to John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign. In late 1962, Factor was again scheduled to be deported to the United Kingdom, but received a presidential pardon. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1963. He became a major contributor to the gubernatorial campaigns of Pat Brown in California. Brown later called him a close friend. He lived his later years in Los Angeles, where he made large charitable contributions to enhance the lives of inner-city children. Factor died from a long, undisclosed illness on January 22, 1984, and was interred at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. Thomas Kinney, nicknamed Snake, was a Missouri state senator and organized crime figure in St. Louis in the early 20th century, and was one of the founding members of the infamous Egan's Rats gang. The Irish-American Thomas Snake Kinney was born and raised in St. Louis's Cary Patch neighborhood, a part of what is now Carr Square. He and his brothers, Michael and William, worked as newsboys during the late 19th century. Tom would always snatch the biggest bundle of papers for himself in the morning, but always square accounts with his victim at the end of the day. One newsboy who had been victimized by Kinney complained to a local beat cop, who exclaimed, "That little Kinney sneaked the papers." The policeman spoke with a thick Irish brogue, so sneak came out sounding like snaked, hence Kinney's nickname. Despite his slender build, Kinney was known as a tough street fighter. He and his family lived on Collins Street, across from the Egan family. Thomas Egan, 6 years younger than Snake, grew to be his best friend. In the late 1880s, Snake Kinney was a neighborhood pool hustler and all-around crook when he entertained the idea for running for office. Kinney was elected to the St. Louis City Democratic City Committee in 1890. Kinney's friends, a street gang headed by Tom Egan, ensured many of Democratic votes at election time for their friend. By 1894, Snake Kinney ran a saloon at 2nd and Carr, which served as a headquarters for the Ashley Street Gang, soon to be known as the Egan's Rats. Kinney and his thugs specialized in armed robbery, burglary, and extortion. His biggest early rival was George Baldy Higgins, an alcoholic sadist who was jealous of Snake's success. He killed Higgins in a street fight in the early morning hours of September 20th, 1896. Snake was acquitted on a charge of self-defense. He eventually married Tom Egan's sister, Catherine, with whom he had a daughter named Florence. By 1901, Snake Kinney and his crew, now one of the most powerful gangs in the city, had formed an alliance with St. Louis Police Board head Harry Hawes, forming a powerful combine against rival gang leaders, including John Bad Jack Williams, John Cuddy Mac McGillicuddy, and John Baldy Ryan. While Snake Kinney was a personable and able legislator, he always retained his street sense and temper. On February 19, 1904, he was charged with verbally abusing and shooting a black lounge singer named Walter Sloan. After this incident, Tom Egan took over the street gang, which soon became known as the Egan's Rats. In November 1904, Thomas Snake Kinney was elected to the Missouri State Senate, representing his St. Louis district. Kinney was able to turn out a staggering number of votes at the polls for the candidates of his choosing, due to the muscle of the Egan gang. Kinney, despite his gangster roots, was known for creating landmark Missouri legislation, curtailing child labor, and limiting women to working only 8-hour days. He also formed an alliance with Louis Lemp, a St. Louis brewing magnate, who proved a valuable ally for the senator. He was defeated in November 1910 for a U.S. Congress seat, and soon after was diagnosed with tuberculosis, from which he died of on May 15, 1912. Kinney's brother-in-law, Tom Egan, suspected his 1910 defeat was the result of a double-crossing political ally named Michael Gill, who betrayed Snake to advance his own ambitions. Egan and his goons complied such a large tally for Gill's opponent in the 1912 election, the congressman was speechless upon his defeat. The gang that Snake Kinney helped found endured as the most powerful St. Louis criminal organization until the early 1920s. Egan's Rats was founded around 1890 by Thomas Snake Kinney and Thomas Egan, two street toughs living in the riverfront Cary Patch neighborhood of St. Louis. Recruiting other members from the neighborhood, the Rats started out as pickpockets, burglars, and armed robbers. The gang also aided the Democratic Party political machine by intimidating voters at polling places on Election Day. Kinney used the gang as a stepping stone into politics. He first served as the 4th Ward's delegate to the Missouri House of Delegates, and later served in the Missouri State Senate. In contrast, Tom Egan stayed in the old neighborhood and became the main leader of the increasingly powerful Rats. By 1904, Egan's Rats was the most powerful street gang in St. Louis. The fabric of the gang were the Democratic political clubs scattered around the city. Most members of the Rats belonged to one club or another. Some Egan-affiliated clubs were the Jolly Five, Cross Keys, and Friendly Ten. The Egan gang's main rival at this time was the violent Bottoms gang from the 22nd Ward. However, the Bottoms gang made the mistake of assaulting police officers and were soon forced out of existence. Ruthless killers, the Rats gang was willing to assassinate anyone, regardless of the consequences. On June 7, 1909, the Rats murdered rival gunman Fred Yellow Kid Morrill in the Four Courts building while he was on trial for killing Egan gangster Sam Young. The Rats got a little taste of their own medicine when John Bad Jack Barry, leader of the Cross Keys Club, was fatally shot in a Northside courtroom on February 24, 1910, by Henry Dieterichsen. By 1912, Tom Egan headed an organization of 300 to 400 men. That same year, he gave an astounding interview to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, in which he flaunted his power and underworld status. The murder of auto mechanic Fred Hess, in particular, underscored the Rats' blatant gangsterism. At high noon on November 7, 1913, dozens of witnesses saw Deputy Constable Harry Levin shoot and kill Hess in front of 2647 Olive Street. Fred Hess was suspected to have snitched on the Rats over a $15,000 railroad swindle. Despite the fact that numerous people saw the unprovoked murder, Levin was acquitted on April 23, 1914. With Snake Kinney's death from tuberculosis, Tom Egan moved the gang into more sophisticated rackets. Correctly suspecting that alcohol consumption would soon be prohibited in the United States, Tom Egan set up a liquor smuggling network in St. Louis. By early 1916, the Egan's Rats went to war with the depleted Bottoms gang. The main cause was disgruntled Egan gangster Harry Cherries Dunn, who was angry that Tom Egan did little to help his imprisoned brother John. Dunn shot and killed original Egan gang member William Skippy Rowan inside Tom Egan's saloon on January 8, 1916. Tom's brother Willie successfully argued to spare Dunn's life. Cherries defected to the Bottoms gang and instigated a full-blown war on August 21, 1916, when he killed Harry Romany, a semi-pro boxer and crook who was allied with the Egan gang. Willie Egan and 4 of his men confronted Cherries Dunn at the Typo Press Club on September 19, 1916. Walter Costello and Frank Gutter Newman shot and killed him. The war between the Egan and Bottoms gangs claimed almost a dozen lives, including both of Harry Dunn's murderers. Despite the passage of a prohibition law, Tom Egan was unable to reap the full benefits of his liquor smuggling ring. Tom died of Bright's disease in 1919. After Tom Egan's death, the Egan's Rats was taken over by his younger brother, Willie. Unfortunately, Willie wasn't a natural leader like his brother. As a result, younger gang members became restless. While Egan wanted to build up the bootlegging business for long-term profits, the younger members wanted the quicker payoffs of armed robberies. Rebelling against Egan, these youthful gangsters, known as Red Hots, began robbing up banks, armored cars, and messengers with lightning rapidity. By 1921, these disputes worsened when Big Maxie Greenberg, a dissatisfied Egan's Rats member, double-crossed Willie Egan over a shipment of whiskey. In retaliation, Egan unsuccessfully attempted to kill Greenberg. At this point, Max defected to a new rival, the Hogan Gang. The Hogan Gang was headed by Egan arch-rival Edward Jelly Roll Hogan, who also served as the Deputy Missouri State Beverage Inspector. On October 31, 1921, Willie Egan was gunned down in front of his Franklin Avenue saloon. The Hogan Gang were considered to be the likely suspects. With the murder of Willie Egan in 1921, William Dint Colbeck took over the Egan's Rats gang. A former plumber and World War I infantryman, Colbeck aggressively led Egan's Rats against the Hogans. Shootings swept the city, with both gangsters and innocent bystanders being killed on the streets. A primary order of business was tracking down Willie Egan's alleged murderers. According to Dint Colbeck, James Hogan, John Doyle, and Luke Kennedy had been paid $10,000 each to kill Egan. Doyle was shot and killed by St. Louis police on January 6, 1922, while Luke Kennedy was trapped in Wellston on April 17, 1922. Kennedy was shot and killed while begging for his life. Jimmy Hogan spent most of the next year in hiding. In the winter of 1923, the Egan-Hogan War was reignited when the Rats killed Hogan lawyer Jacob Mackler on February 21, 1923. The Rats also shot up Jelly Roll Hogan's house at 3035 Cass Avenue on 2 occasions. By now, public outrage had reached a fever pitch, and people were scrambling to figure out how to get the gangs from shooting each other. By the spring of 1923, the Rats forced the battered Hogan gang to sign a peace treaty. Now at peace, the Rats commenced a crime wave of robbery and murder in Missouri and Illinois. The gang was ruthless with anyone who crossed them, including their own members. In the midst of it all, Colbeck maintained the gang's rackets. Headquartered at a St. Louis County roadhouse named the Max Welton Club, the Rats increasingly looked toward their armed robberies for income. In 1924, Egan's Rats would suffer a crushing blow. Fearing for his life, imprisoned gang member Ray Renard started cooperating with federal prosecutors. On November 15, 1924, Colbeck, Louis Red Smith, Steve Ryan, David Chippy Robinson, Oliver Doherty, Frank Hackathall, Charles Red Lanham, Gus Dietmeyer, and Frank Cotton Eppelsheimer were convicted of a Staunton, Illinois, mail robbery and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. With the convictions of Colbeck and his associates, Egan's Rats fell apart. The gang members who hadn't gone to prison scattered across the country, wreaking havoc wherever they went. One crew of ex-Rats, led by Fred Killer Burke, committed numerous robberies, kidnappings, and contract murders throughout the American Midwest. This crew allegedly took part in the infamous 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre of 7 gangsters in Chicago. Burke was involved in the killings of policemen in 1928 and 1929 and died in prison in 1940. Another ex-Rat, Leo Vincent Brothers, was convicted of killing Chicago Tribune reporter Jake Lingle in 1930. 2 other former members, Pete and Thomas Yanni Licavoli, started the River Gang, a large Detroit bootlegging gang that would dominate rackets in both Detroit and Toledo, Ohio. A former Rat named Elmer Macklin would murder Detroit mob boss Chester Lamar in February 1931. Another, Raymond Craneneck Nugent, was involved in the killing of an Ohio policeman in 1928 and vanished in April 1931. By the early 1940s, Kolbeck and most of the imprisoned gang members had been set free. They returned to a St. Louis that had changed over the past 20 years. Kolbeck and some other gang members tried to muscle their way back into power. Most of them went to work for local mob boss Frank Buster Wertman and eventually retired peacefully. However, Kolbeck was machine-gunned to death while driving down a St. Louis street on February 17, 1943.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Ernest the Hawk Rupolo was a hitman for the Luciano crime family and later the Genovese. He would later turn informant and testify against then-captain and future boss Vito Genovese. In 1934, Genovese and Ferdinand Baccia had conspired to cheat a wealthy gambler out of $150,000 in a high-stakes card game in 1934. After the game, Baccia demanded a share of $35,000 because he had introduced the victim to Vito. Rather than pay Baccia anything, Genovese decided to have him murdered. So on September 19, 1934, Vito Genovese, Ernest Rupolo, and 4 associates allegedly shot and killed Baccia in a coffee shop in Brooklyn. Fearing prosecution for the Baccia murder, Genovese fled to Italy in 1937. In the summer of 1944 in New York, Vito was implicated in the Baccia murder by Rupolo. Facing a murder conviction, Ernest Rupolo had decided to become a government witness. On August 27, 1944, U.S. military police arrested Vito Genovese in Italy during an investigation into his running of a black market ring. It was revealed that he had been stealing trucks, flour, and sugar from the army. When Agent Orange C. Dickey of the Criminal Investigation Division examined his background, he discovered that Genovese was a fugitive wanted for the 1934 Baccia killing. However, there was seemingly little interest from the Army or the federal government in pursuing him. After months of frustration, Dickey was finally able to make preparations to ship Genovese back to New York to face trial, but came under increasing pressure. Genovese personally offered Dickey a $250,000 bribe to release him, then threatened Dickey when the offer was refused. Dickey was even instructed by his superiors in the military chain of command to refrain from pursuing him, but refused to be dissuaded. On June 2, 1945, after arriving in New York by ship the day before, Genovese was arraigned on murder charges for the 1934 Baccia killing. He pleaded not guilty. A week later, another prosecution witness named Jerry Esposito was found shot to death beside a road in Norwood, New Jersey. Earlier, another witness, Peter Latempa, was found dead in a cell where he had been held in protective custody. Without anyone to corroborate Rupolo's testimony, the government's case collapsed, and the charges against Genovese were dismissed on June 10, 1946. In making his decision, Judge Samuel Leibowitz commented, "I cannot speak for the jury, but I believe that if there were even a shred of corroborating evidence, you would have been condemned to the electric chair." On August 24, 1964, Ernest Rupolo's body was recovered from Jamaica Bay, Queens. His killers had attached 2 concrete blocks to his legs and tied his hands. It was widely assumed that Genovese had ordered Rupolo's murder for testifying against him in the 1934 Baccia murder trial. John Franzese was accused of murdering Rupolo as a favor to Genovese.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Vito Cascioferro, also known as Don Vito, was an Italian criminal who was a prominent member of the Sicilian Mafia. He also operated for several years in the United States. He is often depicted as the boss of bosses, although such a position does not exist in the loose structure of the Mafia in Sicily. Cassio life is full of myth and mystery. He became a legend even when he was alive, and that legend is partially responsible for creating the image of the gallant gentleman like mafia boss. He is widely considered to have been responsible for the 1909 murder of Joseph Petrosino, head of the New York City Police Department's Italian squad. However, he was never convicted of the crime. Although many sources have identified him as a native of the rural town of Bisaquino, where he was raised, he was actually born in the city of Palermo on the 22nd of January 1862. His parents, Accurcio Cassio and Santa Ippolito, were poor and illiterate. The family moved to Bisaquino when his father became a campiere, an armed guard, with the local landlord, Baron Antonino Inglese, a notorious usurper of state-owned land. The position of campiere often involved mafiosi. According to other sources, at an early age the family moved to Sambuca Zabut, where he lived for approximately 24 years before relocating to Bisaquino, his recognized power base in the mafia. Ferro received no formal education. When still young, he married a teacher from Bisaquino, Brigida Giacone, who instructed him how to read and write. He was inducted into the mafia in the 1880s. He worked as a revenue collector as a young adult, using the position as a cover to carry out his protection racket. His criminal record began with an assault in 1884 and progressed through extortion, arson, and menacing, and eventually to the kidnapping of the 19-year-old Baroness Clorinda Peritelli di Valpatrosa in June 1898, for which he received a 3-year sentence. While incarcerated for attempted extortion, Ferro was recruited into the Sicilian Leagues, a popular movement of democratic and socialist inspiration, by Bernardino Vero, the president of the League in Corleone. The Leagues needed muscle in their social struggle from 1893 to 1894. In 1892, he became the president of the Fascio of Bisaquino. In January 1894, the Fasci were outlawed and brutally repressed on the orders of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi. Many leaders were put in jail. Cassio fled to Tunis for a year. After serving his sentence for his role in the peasant unrest, he returned to a position of social power and pressured authorities in Palermo to put him in charge of granting emigration permits in the district of Corleone. According to mafia historian Salvatore Lupo, Cassio was involved in clandestine emigration network. Sentenced for the kidnapping of the Baroness of Valpatrosa in 1898, Cassio was released in 1900. To escape special police surveillance in Sicily, he sailed to the United States and arrived in New York City at the end of September 1901. He lived for about 21.5 years in New York, acting as an importer of fruits and foods. He also spent 6 months in New Orleans. He was arrested on May 21, 1902, in connection with a large counterfeiting operation in Hackensack, New Jersey. He was arrested at the barbershop of Giuseppe Romano on First Avenue, from which the counterfeit money had been distributed. Ferro managed to escape conviction. His alibi was that he worked at a paper mill, while the other gang members were tried and sentenced. In New York, he became associated with the Morello gang in Harlem, headed by Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo. In September 1904, he returned to Sicily shortly after Police Sergeant Joseph Petrosino of the New York City Police Department ordered his arrest for involvement with the Barrel murder. His application for American citizenship was consequently blocked. Petrosino traced him to New Orleans, where Cassio had gone to escape detection, but he had already slipped away. Some observers consider Cassio as the one who brought the extortion practice of continuing protection in exchange for protection money from Sicily to the United States. "You have to skim the cream off the milk without breaking the bottle," he summarized the system. "Don't throw people into bankruptcy with ridiculous demands for money. Offer them protection instead. Help them to make their business prosperous, and not only will they be happy to pay, but they'll kiss your hands out of gratitude." Back in Sicily, Cassio rose to the position of a local notable. Ward healer of Domenico Ferrantelli, the mayor of Bergio and member of parliament for the district of Bavona, as well as was on good terms with the Baron Inglese. He exercised influence over several Mafia Cosche clans in the towns of Bisaquino, Bergio, Campofiorito, Chiusa Sclafani, Contessa Entellina, Corleone, and Villafranca Sicula, as well as some districts in the city of Palermo. A semi-factual and romantic portrait by journalist Luigi Barzini contributed much to form the legend of Don Vito. Don Vito brought the organization to its highest perfection without undue recourse to violence. The mafia leader who scatters corpses all over the island in order to achieve his goal is considered as inept as the statesman who has to wage aggressive wars. Don Vito ruled and inspired fear mainly by the use of his great qualities and natural ascendancy. His awe-inspiring appearance helped him. His manners were princely, his demeanor humble but majestic. He was loved by all. Being very generous by nature, he never refused a request for aid and dispensed millions in loans, gifts, and general philanthropy. He would personally go out of his way to redress a wrong. When he started a journey, every major, dressed in his best clothes, awaited him at the entrance of his village, kissed his hands, and paid homage as if he were a king. And he was a king of sorts. Under his reign, peace and order were observed. The mafia peace, of course, which was not what the official law of the Kingdom of Italy would have imposed. But people did not stop to draw too fine a distinction. Police reports described Cassio as notoriously associated with the high mafia, leading a life of luxury, going to the theater, cafes, gambling high sums at the Circolo dei Civili, a club for gentlemen, reserved for those with pretensions to education and elite status. Cassio is considered to be the mastermind behind the murder of New York policeman and head of the Italian squad, Joseph Petrosino, on March 12, 1909. He was shot and killed in Piazza Marina in Palermo. Two men were seen running from the crime scene. Petrosino had gone to Sicily to gather information from local police files to help deport Italian gangsters from New York as illegal immigrants. The two men were very much aware of the danger to each other's survival. Petrosino carried a note describing Cassio as a terrible criminal, while Cassio had a photograph of the police officer. Many accounts claim that Cassio personally killed Petrosino. Legend has it that Cassio excused himself from a dinner party among the high society at the home of his political patron, De Michele Ferrantelli, took a carriage, that of his host according to some, and drove to Piazza Marina in Palermo's city center. He and Petrosino engaged in a brief conversation, then Cassio killed Petrosino and returned to join the dinner again. Historical reconstructions have dismissed this version and cannot locate Cassio at the time. News of the murder spread fast in U.S. newspapers, and a swell of anti-Italian sentiment spread across New York. Cassio pleaded his innocence and provided an alibi for the entire period when Petrosino was assassinated. He stayed in the house of De Michele Ferrantelli in Bergio. However, the alibi provided by De Michele Ferrantelli was suspicious, taking into account the connection between the two. Moreover, while in jail after his arrest and life sentence in 1930, Cassio apparently claimed that he had killed Petrosino. According to writer Arrigo Patacco in his 1972 book on Joe Petrosino, Cassio said, "In my whole life I have killed only one person, and I did that disinterestedly. Petrosino was a brave adversary and deserved better than a shameful death at the hands of some hired cutthroat." A report by Baldassare Ceola, the police commissioner of Palermo, concluded that the crime had probably been carried out by mafiosi Carlo Costantino and Antonino Passananti under Cassio direction. Evidence was thin, however, and the case was effectively closed when in July 1911 the Palermo Court of Appeals discharged Cassio as well as Costantino and Passananti due to insufficient evidence to send them to trial. Petrosino's murder was never solved. Nevertheless, Costantino and Passananti were identified as the most likely assassins. Costantino died in the late 1930s, and Passananti in March 1969. In 2014, more than a century after the assassination, the Italian police overheard a tapped phone conversation in which a sibling claimed that Paolo Palazzotto had been the killer on the orders of Cascioferro. Palazzotto had been arrested after the shooting but had been released for lack of evidence. In a recorded conversation during an unrelated investigation by Italian police, the suspected mafia boss, Domenico Palazzotto, told other mafiosi that his great-uncle had killed Petrosino on behalf of Cascioferro. In 1923, the sub-prefect of Corleone warned the Ministry of Interior that Cascioferro was one of the worst offenders, quite capable of committing any crime. In May 1925, he was arrested as the instigator of a murder. He was able to be released on bail as usual. However, with the rise of fascism, his reputation and immunity were declining. In May 1926, Prefect Cesare Mori, under orders from fascist leader Benito Mussolini to destroy the mafia, arrested Cascioferro in a big roundup in the area that included Corleone and Bisacquino. More than 150 people were arrested. Cascioferro's godson asked the local landlord to intervene, but he refused. "Times have changed," was the reply. He was indicted for participation in 20 murders, 8 attempted murders, 5 robberies with violence, 37 acts of extortion, and 53 other offenses, including physical violence and threat. He was sentenced to life imprisonment on June 27, 1930, on the old murder charge. He remained silent during the trial. Cascioferro had been arrested some 69 times before and always had been acquitted, but this time it was different. After hearing the sentence, the president of the court asked Cascioferro if he had something to say in his defense. Cascioferro stood up and said, "Gentlemen, as you have been unable to obtain proof of any of the numerous crimes I have committed, you have been reduced to condemning me for the only one I never committed." The Iron Prefect, as Mori was known, wanted to give maximum publicity to the event. He had posters printed with pictures of Cascioferro and the text of the court sentence. There is uncertainty about the exact date of his death. The most common account is that he died of natural causes in 1945 while serving his sentence at Ucciardone prison in Palermo. Italian author Patacco found evidence for his 1972 book on Joe Petrosino that Cascioferro may have died of dehydration in the summer of 1943. According to Patacco, Cascioferro was left behind in his cell by prison guards while other inmates were evacuated in advance of the Allied invasion of Sicily. However, according to historian Giuseppe Carlo Marino, Cascioferro was transferred to another prison in Pozzuoli in 1940, and the octogenarian was left to die during an Allied bombardment of that prison in 1943. Other sources mention 1942. According to La Stampa, Cascioferro died on September 20, 1943, in the prison on the island of Procida. For years, a sentence believed to be carved by Cascioferro was legible on the wall of his Ucciardone cell. Prison, sickness, and necessity reveal the real heart of a man. Inmates considered occupying Don Vito's former cell a great honor. Historians consider this account a legend rather than fact. Amatuna was born in Pozzallo, Sicily in 1898 and emigrated to the United States in the early 20th century, eventually arriving in Chicago's Little Italy. As a teenager, he worked as a messenger for the Genna brothers, a group of ruthless Sicilian gangsters. He earned a full membership in the Genna gang at age 17 by murdering Frank Lombardi outside a saloon. Lombardi was a supporter of incumbent Chicago alderman John Powers, a bitter enemy of the Genna brothers. The brutal warfare between the Gennas and Powers became known in Chicago as the Aldermen's Wars. Prohibition began in 1920, and Amatuna had already become one of the Gennas' leading members. The brothers continued to battle the Powers faction for political control of the 19th Ward. The Gennas began bootlegging operations and became one of the main suppliers of homemade alcohol to the Torrio Capone gang. Amatuna was the enforcer who oversaw production of the gang's numerous alky cookers, and he became the personal bodyguard for Bloody Angelo Genna by the end of 1920. On September 28th, a bomb exploded on the front porch of Powers' home. In spite of great damage, no one inside was hurt. Powers suspected that Amatuna was the bomber on orders from the Gennas. For the rest of 1920 and into 1921, Powers stationed armed guards and private detectives around his house as he campaigned against Anthony DeAndrea. Despite frequent bombings, Powers narrowly won the election. Enraged by his defeat, Angelo Genna blamed Paul Labriola, a municipal court bailiff and a Powers supporter, for convincing Sicilian and other Italian immigrants to support Powers. On March 9, 1921, Angelo, Amatuna, and Genna Lieutenant Frank Don Chick Gambino shot and killed Labriola. Witnesses identified Genna and Gambino, and the two men were charged with murder. However, the case was eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. Amatuna was later a suspect in the murders of Powers supporters Harry Raimondi and Gaetano Esposito. By age 25, Amatuna had several bank accounts and held interests in various legitimate businesses. He earned the reputation of a dandy and would be seen attending operas with Angelo and other gunmen, often wearing expensive diamond studs and cufflinks, and he bought the Bluebird Cafe, a restaurant in Halsted Street in Chicago. He was confident that he was safe in the Bluebird and never wore his two guns there. He once boasted to reporters that no one can shoot me in here. This place is full of my friends. Any guy who would hurt me here would be torn apart by my patrons. By the mid-1920s, the Genna brothers were enmeshed in a vicious gang war with the North Side Gang, a primarily Irish gang run by Jaime Weiss. In May 1925, Angelo Genna was murdered by the North Siders. Amatuna was in charge of the Genna gang, and he struggled to keep the organization from disintegrating. He walked into the headquarters of the Unione Siciliani, a powerful fraternal group under mob control, and declared himself president, which upset Al Capone. Capone was a Genna ally, but he wanted to control the Unione Siciliani himself. On the evening of November 10, 1925, Amatuna was preparing to attend the opera Aida at the Auditorium Theater with his girlfriend Rose Pecorara. He visited a barbershop on Roosevelt Road for a shave and manicure, his usual habit before going out for the evening. Owner Isidore Paul commented on the fact that he was without his bodyguards, and Amatuna replied that he had not been able to reach them that day. Paul applied a hot towel on Amatuna's face when two unidentified men rushed into the barbershop and drew their guns. The barber's screams alerted Amatuna, who quickly ducked behind the barber chair. However, he was shot in the chest twice during the gunfight as the gunman escaped. Amatuna requested at the hospital that a priest marry him and Rosa, but he died before the ceremony was completed on the morning of the 13th. The identities of the men who killed him were eventually revealed as North Side gang members Vincent, the Schemer, Drucci, and Jim Doherty, with Frank Gusengerg as the driver. However, no charges were ever brought against them. The noted absence of his bodyguards Goldstein and Zion has also been questioned, but it is not known whether they were paid off to stay away that night or if they had defected to the Northsiders, as they were both killed shortly after his death. Zion was killed when returning from Amatuna's funeral on November 17th, and Goldstein was killed with a shotgun in a drugstore by two unidentified gunmen on November 25th. The remaining Genna brothers later commented that Amatuna's death was inevitable after he began hiring non-Sicilian bodyguards, disregarding tradition. The Genna crime family operated in Prohibition-era Chicago. From 1921 to 1925, the family was headed by the 6 Genna brothers, known as the Terrible Gennas. The brothers were Sicilians from the town of Marsala and operated from Chicago's Little Italy and maintained control over the Unione Siciliana. They were allies with fellow Italian gang the Chicago Outfit. After a bloody war led to their demise in the 1920s, the gang was eventually absorbed by the Chicago Outfit. The Genna brothers consisted of 6 Sicilian brothers. Vincenzo James Genna was the leader of the gang. Angelo, Bloody Angelo Genna, the youngest of the 6, was the family's primary enforcer and participated heavily in the 19th Ward political wars of the late 1920s. Mike, the Devil, was generally kept busy with low-level violent tasks. Antonio the Gentleman Genna remained aloof from the day-to-day gang activities, preferring to remain behind the scenes. Sam Genna oversaw the gang's political connections, and Peter ran a saloon. In 1919, the Gennas became involved in bootlegging. They obtained a federal license to legally manufacture industrial alcohol, which they sold illegally. The Genna brothers operated from Chicago's Little Italy, bordered by the Chicago River in the east, Kinsey Street in the north, Kedzie Avenue in the west, and Roosevelt Road in the south. At the onset of Prohibition, the Genna gang was a member of Torio's beer cartel, agreeing to sell its alcohol only within its territory. By 1924, the Genna brothers had begun selling their extra alcohol at cut-rate prices outside their territory. This produced a clash with the Northside gang leader Dean O'Banion, who went to Johnny the Fox Torio and Unione Siciliana boss Mike Merlo to punish the Gennas for breaking the deal. Torio failed to act, and O'Banion and his gang began hijacking shipments of booze that belonged to the Genna brothers. In May 1924, O'Banion set Torio up to be arrested at the Sebin Brewery, kicking off the Beer Wars. Merlo, who had been key in keeping the peace, died in November 1924. The next day, Genna hitmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, joined by Frankie Aiello, shot and killed O'Banion at his flower shop. After O'Banion's murder, the new Northside gang leader, Jaime Weiss, negotiated a temporary truce with the Gennas. The Northsiders focused on attacking the Torio Capone gang, first shooting up Al Capone's car in January 1925, then nearly killing Torio in an ambush outside his home later that month. After leaving the hospital, Torio fled to Italy, leaving Al Capone as boss. By spring 1925, the Northside gang was targeting the Genna brothers. First, Bloody Angelo Genna was killed on May 27, 1925, after a high-speed car chase, then shot him to death. On June 13, 1925, Mike Genna was gunned down by police after a shootout with the Northsiders. Antonio Genna was shot to death on July 8, 1925, in an ambush. The remaining 3 brothers, Jim, Sam, and Pete, fled Chicago. Anthony D'Andrea was a Sicilian mafia boss in Chicago's Little Italy. His closest allies were the Genna brothers, who operated illegal gambling clubs and salons in his territory. In 1919, D'Andrea became president of the Chicago chapter of the Unione Siciliana, an organization dedicated to helping poor Sicilian immigrants. D'Andrea wanted more political power and ran to become alderman of Chicago's 19th Ward, which included Little Italy. This started the Aldermen's Wars between D'Andrea and John Powers, an Irish saloon keeper who was the sitting alderman. He was born in Valedolmo, Sicily in 1872 to a large family. He studied law at the University of Palermo in Palermo, Sicily. In 1897, he immigrated to the United States, briefly settling in Buffalo, New York. He later attended seminary at St. Mary's Academy in Baltimore and St. Bonaventure's Academy in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. In June of 1899, he moved to Chicago, where he was ordained a priest and appointed pastor of St. Anthony's Italian, Independent, Catholic Church under Bishop Antoni Kozlowski. Kozlowski was an adherent of the Old Catholic Church. His brother Orazio Horace also became a priest. In Chicago, Anthony met a young German woman, Carolina Lena Wagner. He fell in love with Lena, left the priesthood, and married her in Milwaukee. However, after their marriage, Lena suddenly disappeared. D'Andrea suspected that the people who sheltered Lena after her parents' deaths were holding her. With help from the police, D'Andrea and Lena were reunited. Now that he was no longer a priest, D'Andrea decided to become a teacher of modern languages. His brother Luis also left the priesthood and married. Because of his education, Anthony assisted other Italian immigrants with legal issues and worked as a professional translator. At some point, he became involved with the mafia, either in Sicily or the United States. While it is not known if there have been members of the clergy who were also mafiosi in America, it has been known to occur in Sicily. In 1902, soon after his marriage, he was arrested as the leader of a counterfeiting gang. After his arrest, D'Andrea initially blamed Lena for the crime. While awaiting trial, some authorities forgot that Anthony was in custody in Chicago and thought he had been murdered in New York City in the 1903 barrel murders. He was convicted in Chicago and sent to Joliet State Prison. His family and supporters started a letter-writing campaign to the federal government for his release. After 13 months in prison, Anthony D'Andrea was released. He continued to work as a translator while also increasing his power within the mafia. In 1911, D'Andrea co-owned a company with Martin Merlo, a brother of close associate Mike Merlo, at 20 East 31st Street in Chicago. That same year, Joseph D'Andrea, no relation to Anthony, was elected president of Local 286 of the International Hod Carriers Building and Construction Union. Joseph appointed Anthony as the local treasurer and business agent. Joseph, a friend and associate of Southside gang boss James Colosimo, allegedly introduced labor racketeering into his union. On September 16, 1914, a man walked up to Joseph and said, "I know you." As Joseph reached out to shake the stranger's hand, the man shot Joseph in the leg, other reports say the stomach, with a double-barreled shotgun. Joseph died shortly thereafter, and Anthony became the new local president. It was also around this time that he became the mafia boss of Chicago, following the murder of the previous leader. At one point, several young men committed certain crimes without his permission, and he ordered their deaths. One of them, identified only as Paolinello, sought refuge in Pittsburgh with mafia boss Nicola Gentile. Gentile persuaded Anthony to allow Paolinello to join the Pittsburgh crime family. Gentile would later describe him as a terrible and fearful man. In 1916, Anthony ran for the office of alderman in the so-called Bloody 19th Ward of Chicago. The 19th Ward, home to many Italian immigrants, suffered from a very high homicide rate due to a large number of honor killings and black hand murders. His opponent was a man called James Bowler. Before Election Day, he dropped out of the race because the Chicago Tribune and other local newspapers had exposed his criminal past. In 1919, Andrea became president of the Chicago head chapter of the Unione Siciliana, a charitable organization dedicated to helping poor Sicilian immigrants. However, he used the union as another means to increase his political base. He also ran for ward committeeman in the 19th. After he was elected, the Illinois Supreme Court negated the election, and Anthony lost the support of John Powers, one of the ward's aldermen. He then decided to run again for alderman against Powers. Powers was an Irish saloon keeper who had been alderman since 1888. He was popular with the Italian community, and this led to the so-called Aldermen's Wars. Murders and bombings became political weapons. The violence reached such a point that D'Andrea condemned it and dropped out of the race. In the early morning hours of May 11, 1921, Anthony D'Andrea was shot while entering his apartment and died the next day at Jefferson Park Hospital. Mike Merlo, who was vacationing in Italy when he heard the news, immediately ordered the assassin's murder. After his return to Chicago, Morello became the mafia boss and Union Siciliana president. Anthony's nephew, Philip D'Andrea, later became a member of the Chicago outfit under boss Al Capone.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
One man who shaped the new era of the mob was Al Capone. He was not a Sicilian and he did not belong to the Camorra, but was of Neapolitan heritage. In fact, he nursed a deep hatred of the Sicilians after his father became a target of the Black Hand extortion gang. His parents had arrived in New York from Naples 6 years before he was born. After dropping out of school, Capone fell under the influence of Johnny Torrio, a saloon and brothel keeper in Brooklyn. Torrio's lieutenant, Frankie Aiello, ran the Harvard Inn in Coney Island and Capone went to work there as a doorman. One evening, Capone told gangster Frank Galluccio's sister that she had a nice ass. Galluccio demanded an apology, but Capone refused. So the gangster pulled out a knife and slashed Capone's left cheek. The wound, which needed 30 stitches, gave Capone the nickname Scarface. Galluccio sat down with the New York bosses after the incident, and Capone was warned not to seek retribution for the injury. Torrio's cousin Victoria Moresco was married to Big Jim Colosimo. Together they ran a chain of brothels in Chicago. When a Black Hand gang led by Sonny Cosmano attempted to extort money from them, Big Jim called for Torrio's help. Within a month, 10 members of Cosmano's gang were dead, but he continued to demand money. Big Jim then agreed to pay him $10,000. However, when Sonny Cosmano and his Black Handers arrived to collect the money, Torrio and 8 of his gunmen were waiting for them. There was a blaze of gunfire. Sonny survived a shotgun blast to the stomach inflicted by Torrio himself. He later fled the city after being smuggled out of the hospital. In 1918, Big Jim persuaded Johnny Torrio to move permanently to Chicago so he could run the brothels there, leaving Frankie Aiello to run the operation in New York. Torrio transformed the boss's minor cheap brothels into a much more lavish, expensive business. But behind the scenes, the girls were kept there by force, and he would not hesitate to kill them if they went to the police. Capone was under investigation for murder in New York at the time, so he followed Torrio to Chicago and went to work as a doorman at the Four Deuces, a bordello. It is thought that he first caught syphilis there. In 1920, Big Jim divorced Torrio's cousin and married Dale Winter, a singer at a club he owned. With the advent of Prohibition, Torrio was eager to move Big Jim's operation into bootlegging, but Dale was against it. Torrio did not take kindly to his refusal. Just 1 month after the wedding, Torrio called Colosimo and asked him to come to the club. When he arrived, he was killed. Capone was the first to be suspected, but the murder had actually been carried out by Frankie Aiello. He avoided arrest because a waiter who had seen the hit refused to identify him. With Big Jim out of the way, Johnny Torrio moved into the bootlegging business full-time, with Capone as his second-in-command. There were only 2 Italian bootlegging gangs at the time. Most of them were Irish, and one was made up of American gangsters. However, from the start, Torrio's operation was one of the biggest. Astutely, he went into partnership with Joseph Stenson, the son of Chicago's leading brewing family. The company had converted its brewery to make near beer, that is, beer with the alcohol removed, but Stenson supplied Torrio with the real stuff. One of Torrio's competitors was Dean O'Banion, an Irish-American who had won a fearsome reputation in the newspaper circulation wars, where thugs were hired to beat up news vendors in order to keep rival publications off the newsstands. Together with 2 Polish Catholics, George Bugsmoren and Earl Jaime Weiss, O'Banion also imported whiskey from Canada. In order to give his operation a respectable front, he bought into a florist's opposite Holy Name Cathedral, which also did good business at gangsters' funerals. Under an agreement with Torrio, O'Banion controlled the north side of Chicago. He also supplied some of the thugs that supported Al Capone's mayoral candidate in the 1924 Cicero elections. Chicago's Sicilian west side was dominated by the 6 Genna brothers, who came from Marsala. After arriving in Chicago in 1910, the terrible Gennas quickly established a reputation for violence. They bought a license to produce and sell industrial alcohol, but they made whiskey and other spirits instead, paying the inhabitants of Little Italy $15 a day to run home stills. Their cheap liquor was colored with coal tar and creosote and fortified with wood alcohol and fuel oil, which sometimes made it lethal. As if the Gennas' reputation were not fearsome enough, they also employed 2 enforcers, Alberto Anselmi and Giovanni Scalise, who had entered America illegally after a purge of the Sicilian mafia. It was said that they greased their bullets with garlic, which was thought to give gangrene to anyone who was not killed instantly. Few lived long enough to find out, however. Like the other bootleggers, the Gennas depended on the assistance of corrupt officials and police officers who were among the regular customers of their liquor store. The agreement between Torrio and O'Banion held up for 3 years, and then Irish gangs began hijacking Torrio's trucks and smashing up his speakeasies. In an attempt to placate O'Banion, Torrio offered him some territory in Cicero and a quarter share in a casino called the Ship. O'Banion then persuaded the owners of a number of speakeasies in other parts of Chicago to move to Cicero, thereby altering the balance of power. Meanwhile, the Gennas began moving in on Dean's territory on the north side. In response, he ordered Angelo Genna to pay off the $30,000 debt he owed at the Ship. When he refused, O'Banion began hijacking the Gennas' deliveries. The Gennas wanted to eliminate him, but first of all they needed the green light from the Unione Siciliana, a benefit society for Sicilian immigrants that worked as a front for the mafia. But the president of its Chicago chapter, Mike Merlo, tried to keep the peace. Meanwhile, O'Banion killed John Duffy, a Philadelphia hitman who had brought unwelcome attention to the gang by killing his own wife. He then tried to put the blame on Torrio and Capone. At the time, O'Banion was selling his stake in an illegal brewery to Torrio for $500,000, but while the deal was going through, the police raided the brewery and Torrio was arrested. He already had convictions for breaking the prohibition laws, so he faced a jail sentence. On top of that, he had just paid $500,000 for a useless brewery, and O'Banion refused to compensate him. Mike Merlo then died of cancer, which made it easier to go after O'Banion, so Torrio and the Gennas planned a joint hit. Frankie Aiello was called in. Pretending to be the president of the New York chapter of the Unione Siciliana, he visited O'Banion's flower shop to order flowers for Merlo's funeral. On the following day, he returned with Alberto Anselmi and Giovanni Scalise, who shot O'Banion dead on the spot. Chicago's gangsters then spent another $10,000 on flowers, including a basket from Al Capone. Jaime Weiss was seen to cry like a baby at O'Banion's funeral. He then took charge of O'Banion's North Side gang and swore to revenge his dead boss. Figuring that Capone was behind the hit, Weiss, George Bugs Moran, and Vincent the Schemer Drucci ambushed Capone's car outside a South Side restaurant, injuring his chauffeur using the Thompson machine guns that had recently been introduced to the Chicago underworld. Capone was unscathed but shaken, so he put in an order for a bulletproof car. A 1928 Cadillac, it would have 3,000 pounds of armor plating under the standard body, inch-thick bulletproof windows, a siren, and a flashing red light. While being painted the same color as Chicago police vehicles, it is also thought to have been the first private car with a police band radio receiver. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was used by President Roosevelt, who feared assassination by enemy agents. Weiss and his gunmen then went after Torrio. As he was returning from a shopping trip with his wife, gunfire from a .45 automatic and a 12-gauge shotgun hit him in the chest, arm, groin, legs, and jaw. Torrio was lying injured on the pavement when Moran tried to finish him off by putting a .45 to his temple and pulling the trigger, but the gun misfired. At that point, the police arrived and the would-be killers fled. From his hospital bed, Torrio handed over his entire operation to Capone. Throughout the police investigation, Torrio observed the omertà. He served time in jail for Volstead violations and then retired to Italy. Weiss and the North Side Gang were also pursuing the Gennas for their part in O'Banion's murder. On May 26, 1925, Angelo Genna was out driving when a large open car pulled up alongside his vehicle. In it were Weiss, Moran, and Drucci, who immediately opened fire. Genna's car careered into a lamppost, and a dozen more shots were fired into his defenseless body. Nevertheless, the dying Genna was still conscious when he reached the hospital. A policeman asked him who had attacked him, but he said nothing. 2.5 weeks later, Moran and Drucci were injured in a shootout with Alberto Anselmi, Giovanni Scalise, and Mike the Devil Genna. They were making off in a car driven, it is thought, by Samuzo Samut's Amatuna when they were spotted by the police. In the ensuing car chase, the driver of Genna's car swerved to avoid a truck, and the vehicle smashed into a lamppost. When the police caught up with them, 2 patrolmen were gunned down. The mobsters then ran off, but Mike Genna was cornered. He turned his shotgun on another officer, but the gun failed to fire. Hit in the leg, he still managed to jump through the basement window of a nearby house. As the police entered, he fired a random shot, but it was all over. He was already dying from loss of blood on the way to the hospital. Even so, he had enough strength to kick the ambulance driver in the face. After 2 more officers had died of their wounds, Anselmi and Scalise were arrested. Speaking through a translator, they claimed they had acted in self-defense. They blamed the firefight on Genna, who was not there to defend himself. Nevertheless, Anselmi and Scalise were convicted of the manslaughter of Olsen and were sentenced to 14 years in prison. While they were inside, they were beaten up and an attempt was made to poison Scalise with cyanide. A defense fund was set up by fellow Sicilians, and Angelo Genna's brother-in-law, Henry Spingola, was killed when he refused to contribute. At subsequent trials, the verdict was overturned, and they were acquitted. They went to work for Al Capone as soon as they were freed. Meanwhile, life was getting difficult for the Gennas. On July 8, 1925, Tony Genna was set up by his bodyguard Antonio Cavallero Spano, who lured him to the corner of Grand Avenue and Curtis Street, where he was killed by 2 gunmen. Spano was killed the following year on the orders of Sicilian-born Giuseppe Joe Aiello. His body was shipped back to Italy. The surviving Genna soon left town. James Genna went back to Italy with Johnny Torrio, but he was arrested for stealing jewels from the statue of the Madonna di Trapani in the Basilica of Maria Santissima Annunziata in his native Sicily. He served time with hard labor on Favignana, a small island off the west coast of Sicily. When he returned to Chicago in 1930, he was driving along with 4 former Genna gang members when another car pulled up alongside their vehicle and sprayed them with bullets. One of the gang members was killed and 2 others were injured. James Genna fled to Calumet City, where he died of natural causes in the following year. With the Gennas now out of the picture, Capone united the Italian and Sicilian factions and took control of the south and west sides of Chicago. Meanwhile, Weiss, Moran, and what was left of the O'Banion mob allied themselves with Jewish, Polish, and German gangs so they could hold the north side. Capone also held on to the political influence that had been built up by Big Jim Colosimo and Johnny Torrio. One of his allies was Illinois Governor Len Small, who pardoned or paroled over 1,000 convicted bootleggers and other felons. While he was governor, Small was indicted for embezzling $600,000 and running a money laundering scheme when he had been state treasurer. His acquittal perhaps owed something to the fact that 4 of the jurors were subsequently hired as state employees. Another of Capone's cronies was Big Bill Thompson, the Republican mayor of Chicago from 1915 to 1923. During the Prohibition era, he declared himself to be as wet as the Atlantic Ocean, which went down well with many people, especially bootleggers. However, when he abolished the Chicago Police Force's moral squad, leaving the city wide open to vice, he was ousted by Democrat reformer William Dever, who rode into power in 1923 on the backlash. Dever then targeted Capone, who simply transferred the remainder of his business to the self-governing suburb of Cicero. Capone had 161 saloons there, together with dozens of gambling houses and brothels. On Election Day in 1924, Capone brought in 200 thugs to beat up the Democrats. 100 policemen were drafted in to quell the riot, and a gunfight broke out. Al Capone escaped, but his brother Frank was killed and his cousin Charlie Fischetti was arrested. Nevertheless, Capone hung on to Cicero. That November, Capone's only rival in Cicero, Eddie Tankle, was killed in a contrived gunfight with Miles O'Donnell and James Dougherty. On April 27, 1926, Assistant State Attorney William McSwiggan unsuccessfully prosecuted O'Donnell and Dougherty, and the two killers walked free. Suspiciously, he went out for a drink with them in Cicero that same night, but the party was ambushed outside the Pony Inn. McSwiggan and 2 members of the O'Donnell gang were killed. There were 5 grand jury investigations. Capone was a suspect, but he denied any involvement in McSwiggan's murder. Out of his $100 million a year turnover, $30 million went in bribes to the police, public officials, and politicians. In 1927, he gave Big Bill Thompson $260,000 so that he could run for mayor again. Thompson beat Dever by 83,000 votes. Capone also added journalists to his payroll. In June 1930, the Chicago Tribune's top crime reporter, Alfred Jake Lingle, was shot dead in the subway station of the Illinois Central Railroad. His editor swore revenge, but then it was discovered that Lingle had been bankrolled by Capone for years. He was a regular guest at Capone's Miami home, and he had died wearing a diamond-encrusted belt buckle given to him by Capone. Capone also curried favor with the public by doing good deeds. He supported striking miners in Pennsylvania and paid for the repair of a church roof. He also moved into labor unions and legitimate businesses, bringing people outside the Italian community into the Capone syndicate. He even tried to control the Unione Siciliana, which he could not join, being a Neapolitan. And he was unapologetic about his bootlegging. The war between Capone's syndicate and the North Siders rumbled on. On August 3, 1926, the body of Anthony Quaringione, a.k.a. Tommy Ross, was found in a cistern. The North Siders had kidnapped him several months before and tortured him to death in an attempt to obtain information on Capone's routine. A week later, there was a shootout between Weiss, Drucci, and some of Capone's men in broad daylight in front of the Standard Oil building. No one was killed, but Drucci was arrested. On September 20, 1926, Capone was dining in the Hawthorne Hotel, his headquarters in Cicero, when 8 carloads of Northsiders drove by, spraying the restaurant with bullets. Capone emerged unscathed after being thrown to the ground by his bodyguard Frank Rio. But a veteran of the gunfight outside the Standard Oil building, Louis Barco, was hit, and a woman got a piece of broken glass in her eye. Capone paid her medical bills and settled the account for repairs to the hotel. Al Capone then tried to broker peace by setting up a meeting between Weiss, Drucci, and his own representative Antonio the Scourge Lombardo. Capone made his own contribution by telephone, which led some to believe that he was scared to meet Weiss face to face. Weiss demanded that Capone hand over Anselmi and Scalise for their part in the killing of O'Banion, but Capone refused. "I wouldn't do that to a yellow dog," he declared. Weiss then stormed out of the meeting, and Capone decided that he must die. On the 11th of October 1926, Weiss was machine-gunned on the steps of Holy Name Cathedral. Hit by 10 bullets, he died on his way to hospital. One of his henchmen also died, and 3 others were injured, They were only saved because the Tommy gun jammed on the 39th bullet. Drucci died on April 4, 1927. He was shot in the back of a squad car while trying to wrestle a gun from a detective who had arrested him after he had ransacked an election office. Capone's residence and headquarters was the Metropole Hotel until 1928, and then he moved to the Lexington, 1 block to the north. It contained a shooting gallery that his men used for target practice, secret vaults where he kept his money, and dozens of secret passages and stairways, including one behind his medicine chest. These led to hidden tunnels that ran to local taverns and whorehouses and provided escape routes in case of a raid by the police or rivals. In 1929, Capone was able to celebrate the new year in his new home on Palm Island, Miami. Not yet 30 years old, he was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld. He ran his business in Chicago through daily telephone calls to his trusted aide, Jake Greasy Thumb Gusengerg. Together they were planning the final act in the outfit's takeover of Chicago, the elimination of Bugs Moran. Capone was still in Florida on the 14th of February when a Miami official called to ask him how much he had paid for his Palm Island home. Unwittingly, the official had provided the perfect alibi. In the garage of the SMC Cartage Company on 2122 North Clark Street, 6 of Moran's top men were waiting for a delivery of whiskey. Capone's men, some disguised as policemen, then turned up, but Moran was late. When he finally arrived, he assumed the place was being raided, so he quietly made off. Capone's men then lined all of Moran's henchmen up against the wall and machine-gunned them. It seems that they thought Moran was one of them. One of the corpses was that of Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer, an optician who appears to have got a kick out of hanging around with gangsters. The men in uniform then escorted their non-uniformed colleagues out of the garage as if they were being arrested. When the police arrived, top Moran gunman Frank Gusengerg was still alive. Although he knew he was going to die, he refused to talk. But there was little doubt about who was responsible. Only Capone kills like that, Moran declared. At first, the police were afraid that they might be implicated. After all, uniformed men had been seen at the garage. But they quickly found the dismembered remains of the Cadillac that had been used by the gunman. It was being stored in a burnt-out garage belonging to friends of Capone. Machine Gun Jack McGurn was the first to be arrested. He had earlier been machine-gunned by Frank Gusengerg and had vowed revenge. McGurn claimed to have been with his girlfriend at the time, but the prosecutor did not believe him. He was then charged with perjury, but he quickly married his girlfriend so that she could not be forced to testify against him. Giovanni Scalise and a young triggerman named Tony Accardo were also picked up, but there was no evidence against them. No one was ever charged with the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and the case remains officially unsolved. Capone himself was questioned in Florida by the Dade County solicitor. Afterwards, he held a party for the celebrities who were there to watch the world title fight. When he was asked who he thought was responsible, Capone suggested Bugs Moran. With his power greatly reduced, Moran was no longer a threat to Capone. His enforcers could not compete with Capone's tough guys, Anselmi and Scalise. The two thugs simply walked into any speakeasy that did not buy its beer from Capone and then smashed up the barrels. But the pair of Sicilians had ambitions of their own. They wanted to take over in Chicago. To that end, they plotted with Joe Giunta, the head of the Unione Siciliana. But Capone had eyes everywhere. He and Frank Rio faked a falling out, and when Anselmi and Scalise tried to convince Rio to support them, he reported back to his boss. Capone then arranged a big party in the back room of a restaurant in Hammond, Indiana, to which he invited Anselmi, Scalise, and Giunta. After dinner, Capone made a speech praising his honored guests. Then someone handed him a baseball bat, and he said, "I understand you want my job. Well, here it is." And he began beating them savagely. They were then shot several times, and their bodies were dumped in a local park. In March 1929, Herbert Hoover became president. He was determined to crack down on gangsters, so he turned to the Treasury's Special Intelligence Unit, who sent their top investigator, Frank Wilson, to find out why Capone had not paid any taxes. Capone had never filed a tax return. This was not illegal unless you earned more than $50,000 a year. As Capone's name did not appear on any business records or bank accounts, his income was hard to prove. Indeed, right up until 1927, professional criminals believed that they were not liable to taxation, because declaring their earnings from illegal activities would be tantamount to self-incrimination, which would be a violation of their rights under the Fifth Amendment. Bootlegger Manly Sullivan argued this in front of the Supreme Court, who decided that the Fifth Amendment had not been passed in order to guarantee criminals freedom from taxation. Armed with this ruling, Wilson and his investigators went after other bootleggers. Soon they were closing in on Capone. Jake Gusengerg, Capone's underworld accountant, was jailed for 5 years, and his brother, Sam Big Belly Gusengerg, went down for 3 years, along with Capone's underboss, Frank Nitti. Capone's brother Ralph was also jailed for 3 years after banking $8 million under a false name. Al Capone did not have a bank account, and he did not sign checks or own any assets, on paper at least, but it was possible to show that he lived a lavish lifestyle. He spent $1,500 a week on hotel bills and $39,000 a year on telephone calls, while over $7,000 a year was spent on handmade clothing. Then there was the $26,000 he had spent on furnishings for his Miami home. Some of those who ran his gambling operations in Cicero were also persuaded to speak up. In the end, Capone was charged with non-payment of tax on $1 million between 1925 and 1929. Capone's lawyers made a deal with the prosecution. He would plead guilty if he did not go to jail for more than 2.5 years. The judge threw this deal out. Capone's henchmen then bribed the jury, but another jury was sworn in at the last moment. In court, Capone tried to play the part of Robin Hood, but this was the Depression, and the jurors were appalled by his extravagance. He had spent $50,000 on improvements to his Miami home, $8,000 on diamond belt buckles like the one he had given to Jake Lingle, and $135 on handmade shirts with a special pistol pouch. The foreman on his Florida estate testified that Capone paid him $550 a month, more than Capone himself claimed to be earning. In an attempt to rescue the situation, his lawyers produced bookmakers who confirmed that Capone had lost $327,000 betting on horse races. But this only made the situation worse. It showed that Capone must have had the money in the first place and could afford to throw it away recklessly. Capone was convicted, fined $50,000, and sentenced to 11 years imprisonment, the heaviest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion. After an appeal failed, he was moved from the county jail to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. In August 1933, he became a founder inmate of Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. After Alcatraz, he was transferred twice before ending up in the Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. By the time he was released from Lewisburg in November 1939, he was suffering from tertiary syphilis. He lived for another 7 years in his Florida home, while his brain slowly decayed. When Capone was sentenced, Judge Herbert Wilkerson said, "This is the beginning of the end of gangs as Chicago has known them for the last 10 years. But he was mistaken. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the bootleggers had made so much money that they had diversified into gambling, prostitution, and a range of legitimate businesses. And their bars and clubs were no less popular because they were legal. Flashy, high-profile Al Capone might have taken a fall, but the mafiosi who were modestly dressed and liked to stay in the background continued to thrive.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Roger Toohey was an Irish-American mob boss and Prohibition-era Chicago bootlegger. He is best remembered for having been framed by his rivals in Chicago for the fake 1933 kidnapping of Jewish-American organized crime figure and Chicago outfit associate John "Jake the Barber" Factor, a brother of cosmetics manufacturer Max Factor Sr. He was born on September 18, 1898 in Chicago, Illinois, to James A. Toohey and his wife, Mary, née Morgan. The father, James, was an immigrant from Ireland. Roger was one of 8 children, the youngest of 6 boys, with an older and a younger sister. Working for the Chicago Police Department at that time, Patrolman James Toohey was known to be fiercely honest and incorruptible, but he was also a strict disciplinarian who beat his children so severely that his neighbors complained. Mary Toohey was a devout Catholic who required her children to attend Mass regularly. The Toohey family lived near Polk Street and South Damon Avenue on Chicago's near west side. Roger initially attended local public school in Chicago. In 1908, Mary Toohey died after a stove in the kitchen exploded and caused a fire, after which James Toohey moved his family to Downers Grove, Illinois. The family was Roman Catholic, and Toohey was an altar boy at their church. He attended St. Joseph Catholic School in Downers Grove, graduating from the 6th grade as valedictorian of his class. All but one of Roger's brothers were engaged in criminal activity. James Toohey Jr. was shot and killed by a police officer during an armed robbery in 1917. John Toohey was killed by members of the Chicago outfit, then led by Al Capone, in 1927 while engaged in bootlegging. Joe Toohey was killed by Victor Willert, a roadhouse owner, in 1929 after Joe threatened his life for refusing to buy moonshine from the gang. Tommy the Terrible Toohey served 6 of a 12-year sentence at Indiana State Prison for robbing the L.S. Ayres & Company department store in Indianapolis in 1924. Paroled in 1930, he served 11 of a 23-year sentence for stealing $78,000 from a mail shipment at a Milwaukee, Wisconsin train station on January 3, 1933. Only Eddie Toohey, a bartender, seemed to steer clear of crime. Roger began working full-time for a living at the age of 13. His ham radio hobby enabled him to get a job as a telegrapher with Western Union, and he proved so adept that he was soon made manager of the small office where he worked. He was fired in 1915 for expressing support for unionization efforts. Roger Toohey says he spent some time as a union organizer for the Commercial Telegraphers Union of America, but felt the job had no security. He joined the Order of Railroad Telegraphers, which qualified him for a well-paying railroad job. He obtained a position with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and moved to Colorado. When the United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917, Roger Toohey would enlist in the United States Navy a year later. However, he did not see combat. Rather, the Navy assigned him to a teaching post at Harvard University near Boston, Massachusetts. The college had lent the Navy classroom space, and Toohey taught officers Morse code. For the rest of his life, Toohey tried to impress people by claiming he was at Harvard. After leaving the Navy, he traveled to Oklahoma with a friend from the Navy. He paid a petroleum engineer a bottle of bootleg corn whiskey to spend a few hours teaching him the fundamentals of petroleum engineering. He bluffed his way into a petroleum engineering job, paying the drilling rig and well mechanics and corn whiskey to do his job. Saving $1,000, $17,600 in today's money, he began speculating in oil leases with his Navy friend. After about a year in Oklahoma, Toohey had made $25,000, $400,000 in today's money. He returned to Chicago, and on April 22, 1922, he married a 23-year-old telegraph operator, Clara, whom he had met 7 years earlier while working for Western Union. His initial employment after his marriage was legitimate and included being a successful automobile salesman by day and a taxicab driver by night. He made $50,000 a year selling cars. In 1927, he formed a legitimate trucking firm with his brothers Eddie and Tommy. His first son, Roger Scott Toohey, was born in 1927 as well. The same year, he moved his family to Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. Des Plaines was still quite a rural area, and the family lived in a large home on a farm on River Road, just north of Maryville Academy. According to Toohey, he began to bootleg immediately after founding his trucking firm. Shortly thereafter, bootlegger Matt Kolb allowed him to buy into his business. Kolb owned a saloon near Rogers' automobile dealership, and he said he once sold Kolb a vehicle. Kolb had once been part of Al Capone's Chicago outfit, supplying as much as a third of the beer it sold, but quit as the outfit became more violent. For an investment of $10,000, $200,000 in 2023 dollars, Toohey became a partner with Kolb. Toohey's bootlegging business expanded dramatically. Toohey and Kolb built 10 illegal beer and liquor breweries northwest of Chicago and built a wooden barrel manufacturing plant in Schiller Park for transporting the goods. Toohey purchased oil trucks and had them painted to look like Texaco vehicles to hide the delivery of his alcohol. He even hired off-duty police officers to drive the trucks to help avoid arrests. Unlike other bootleggers, Toohey and Kolb consulted a chemist and brewed a high-quality beer. Demand for Toohey's beer was extremely high. Toohey and Kolb sold their bootleg alcohol to a network of 200 bars, nightclubs, and roadhouses west and northwest of Chicago. They regularly sold 18,000 bottles of beer a week. During summer, the peak season for beer drinking, they could sell an enormous 1,000 barrels of beer a week. Toohey and Kolb also got into the slot machine racket in 1926. Although illegal, slot machines were highly popular, and Toohey and Kolb were able to put hundreds of them in drugstores, gas stations, grocery stores, and taverns throughout the area they controlled. The two men grossed $1 million, $17.2 million in today's money, from slot machines alone that first year. For several years, Toohey avoided problems with law enforcement by becoming one of the best fixers in the Chicago area. Like nearly all bootleggers, he paid extensive bribes to judges, police, and prosecutors, and he supplemented his payments with free shipments of his high-quality beer, which often was more prized than the cash. For high-level officials, Toohey printed personalized labels for each person to whom he gave bottled beer. He aided law enforcement by keeping bottom-rung gangsters, who were more likely to cause problems for a community, out of Des Plaines, and refused to allow brothels to operate in the northwest and west suburbs of Chicago. He won the grudging respect of the local community for regularly donating large amounts of beer to local civic, fraternal, and social fundraising events, and for buying ice cream for hundreds of children each Sunday. By the late 1920s, the Chicago outfit was ordering hundreds of barrels of beer a week from Toohey and Kolb. At one point, Toohey was selling Capone 800 barrels of beer a week at a discounted price of $37.50 per barrel, $658 in today's money, making a profit of 488% on each barrel. Capone first tested Toohey's toughness by sending outfit members Willie Heaney and Frank Rio to meet with him. The men told Roger that Capone felt the northwestern suburbs were virgin territory for brothels, illegal gambling, and taxi dance halls. Toohey's gang was small, so he chose to intimidate Heaney and Rio. He lined his office walls with handguns and rifles, and borrowed submachine guns from the local police. Roger hired off-duty police officers and local farmers to lounge around the building while armed. While he talked with Humphreys, men would occasionally enter the office, grab a weapon, and casually tell Toohey they were going to kill someone. He would nod in agreement or mumble his approval. He also arranged for a man to call his office every few minutes. He would answer the phone, pretend to listen, and then order someone intimidated or killed. Toohey told Humphreys that he didn't want anything Capone was offering and to stay out of his territory. Humphreys and Fawcett left convinced that his gang was large, well-armed, and ruthless, and that a gang war would be devastating to the Chicago outfit. Capone backed down. Word of the meeting spread, and he gained the unlikely nickname Toohey the Terrible. A short time later, Capone sent Louis Little New York Campagna and Jack Machine Gun McGurn to him. They advised Roger Toohey to turn over part of his business to the Chicago outfit, but he refused. Once more, Roger play-acted for the men, who left convinced that he was more powerful than he really was. According to Roger Toohey himself, he now approached local law enforcement and retailers and told them about Capone's interest in the western suburbs. He asked them to resist Capone's attempt to get them to sell punch boards or buy low-quality beer, and in turn, he said he would resist Capone. Capone now attempted to lure him into a trap. He sent Frankie Diamond, Sam Hunt, and Frank Rio to see the Irish boss again. The play acting did not impress Frank Rio this time, even after Toohey claimed to have 200 prison-toughened thugs in his gang. Roger, sensing trouble, told the trio that he was hosting a party for all his men that night at the Arch, his Schiller Park roadhouse. Roger Toohey invited Capone, Frank Nitti, and all the other top leaders of the Chicago outfit to the party. He had no intention of hosting a party. Instead, he closed the roadhouse early in the evening and removed all liquor from the premises. Chicago police and Cook County Sheriff's men raided the premises that evening, sent there on a tip by Capone. Capone then laid a second trap. He sent Murray Humphreys to Toohey to suggest an alliance. Humphreys and his driver bodyguard, James Red Fawcett, met with Toohey and asked him to come to Capone's headquarters in Cicero, Illinois, to meet with underboss Frank Nitti and hammer out a deal. Warned by a Capone insider that the outfit intended to kill him, Toohey told Murray Humphreys that Frank Nitti should come to Schiller Park. When Humphreys threatened Toohey, they pointed a shotgun at him. Murray Humphreys was visibly intimidated, and Roger Toohey sent him back to Nitti, humiliated. Capone's last attempt to intimidate Toohey came on March 4, 1931, when an outfit member named Summers visited Toohey and once again proposed bringing brothels, gambling, and taxi dance halls to the northwestern suburbs. Toohey bribed two of his men to take Summers out drinking. They ended up at Capone's Cotton Club in Cicero, where the two men successfully urged Summers to pick a fight with Ralph Capone, who ran the club and whom Summers did not know. Two federal law enforcement officers drinking at the club came to Ralph's defense and were disarmed. Toohey's men kept their firearms. Capone desperately needed to return the federally owned firearms to the Treasury agents and contacted Toohey. Toohey feigned ignorance of the two men's identity and suggested that Summers knew who they were, but Capone had already had Summers killed. Federal officials raided the Cotton Club on March 12th and again on March 13th, looking for the guns, and shut it down. Capone began to apply pressure in other ways. Chicago mob members began to occasionally travel to the western and northwestern suburbs and engage in short gunfights with the Irish boss's men. On April 8, 1931, Anton Cermak was sworn in as mayor of Chicago. As chair of the Cook County Board of Commissioners from 1923 to 1931, Cermak had gotten along very well with Toohey. Cermak had pledged to clean up Chicago and get rid of violent gangs. The mayor was allegedly advised that strict enforcement of prohibition was impossible. A better option was to have a good gang, like Toohey's takeover from the Chicago outfit, which was not only more violent, but also promoting gambling, prostitution, and a wide range of other vices. He then met Roger Toohey and urged him to take over Capone's territory. Roger, whose gang was relatively small and nonviolent, balked. The mayor then suggested that the Chicago Police Department would assist in putting pressure on the outfit through raids, arrests, prosecutions, and even killings. Cermak allegedly offered to allow Toohey to take over bootlegging in Chicago if the war was successful. Toohey's men now began engaging in gun battles with Chicago outfit members within the Chicago city limits. The alleged alliance between Cermak and Toohey alarmed Al Capone. Sometime in the first 3 months of 1931, while Toohey was vacationing in Florida, Capone's men threatened Matt Kolb with death if he did not pay them $25,000, $500,000 in today's money. Kolb did so. Capone then had Kolb kidnapped. Toohey paid a $50,000 ransom to free him. Sensing Kolb was the weak link in the Toohey-Kolb partnership, Capone sent several capos into the northwestern suburbs and seized 40 of Kolb's bars, clubs, and resorts in early May 1931. Roger Kolb's liquor was poured out, his gambling machines destroyed, and the managers was told to buy alcohol from Capone in the future. Capone then ordered Matt Kolb killed. Just before 2 in the morning on October 18, 1931, 2 Capone hitmen murdered Kolb inside his club in Morton Grove, Illinois. After Kolb's death, Toohey lived in fear and surrounded himself with armed guards. Toohey's involvement with the labor movement began again in 1929, when Capone approached Toohey with a proposal to take over several Chicago area locals of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, IBT. Marcus Studdy Looney of Chicago Outfit met with Toohey and showed him a list of various American Federation of Labor, AFL unions in the area, and how much money each of them had in their treasury. The Teamsters were a particular focus of the outfit. Toohey declined to participate in the scheme. Capone went ahead with the takeovers of the local unions anyway. The outfit's attempt to take control of the Teamsters District Council and other local unions began in the fall of 1930. At first, the presidents of the independent Teamsters and other union officials sought help from Toohey and other non-outfit gangsters. They purchased homes close to Toohey and Des Plaines in the hope that proximity would discourage assassination attempts. These labor officials began hiring bodyguards, many of whom were ex-gangsters. As Toohey told a federal court in 1952, William Rooney, president of Sheet Metal Workers Union, Patrick Barrell, vice president of the IBT, and Art Wallace, secretary-treasurer of the Painters Union, met with Toohey in 1931 and asked him to hold on to $125,000 which they had raised as a fund to fight outfit takeovers. Toohey claims he retained the money until Barrell and Jerry Horan, president of the Building Service Employees International Union, retrieved it sometime later. Thomas J. Courtney, who became Cook County State's attorney in 1933, was ostensibly a reformer who professed a desire to root out organized crime influence in the labor movement. Courtney had little interest in doing so, intending to use his defense of collective bargaining as a means of seeking higher office. Modern historians agree that, behind the scenes, Courtney engaged in collusion with gang leaders. The Chicago District Council of Teamsters, an umbrella group for Teamster locals in the area, had broken away from the IBT in 1905, and now Courtney colluded with the AFL and IBT to force the Independent District Council back into the IBT. Courtney's chief investigator, Chicago Police Captain Daniel Gilbert, became the point man for Courtney's efforts. Under the agreement, Thomas Courtney had to approve of the leaders of IBT locals in the area and was permitted to bar certain individuals from membership. He faced a Chicago outfit in disarray. When Al Capone was imprisoned on October 24, 1931, only 2 of the Chicago outfit's top leaders remained out of prison. Lower-level mobsters now fought for control of the Chicago mob. Irish gangster and outfit member George "Red" Barker had been in control of a number of union locals in Chicago since 1928, and now began using this base of power to put pressure on the Sicilian mobsters who had dominated the outfit under Capone. Barker was murdered in June 1932. The press reported at the time that the Sicilian faction was responsible, although labor historian David Scott Whitwer says someone from Toohey's gang was the likely culprit. After Barker's death, Captain Gilbert began putting Courtney-approved leaders in charge of the liberated local unions. In retaliation for the Barker murder, the outfit killed Barrell in July 1932. Toohey was aware of the collusion between Courtney and the IBT to dominate the district council. After the death of Barker, Courtney installed a pro-IBT president as president of the coal haulers and removed Looney as president of the excavating, grading, and dump drivers. On February 2, 1933, Tommy Toohey and other members of the Toohey gang attacked James Fur Sammons, a hitman for the O'Donnell gang, and several others involved in labor racketeering, but managed to neither kill nor wound anyone. Worried that Toohey's attack might embolden union leaders to resist the outfit, Frank Nitti ordered a series of vandalisms and bombings that intimidated business owners and unions alike, into remaining under the outfit's control. The Cullen-Harrison Act, which legalized the sale in the United States of beer and wine with an alcohol content of 3.2% by weight, went into effect on April 7, 1933. Organized crime sought to retain its profits by imposing a protection racket on now legal brewers. On April 8th, the Prima Brewing Company plant in Chicago was bombed, and there was some suggestion that Roger Toohey, not the Chicago outfit, had planted the explosive device. His last known involvement with the labor movement came in April 1933. Early that month, Horan and Arthur Wallace, Secretary-Treasurer of the Chicago District Council of the Painters Union, met with Toohey and told him they were giving in to the Chicago outfit's demands. Horan asked Captain Gilbert to set up a meeting with the outfit and turned his union over to the mob. Wallace did the same. On Friday, April 28, 1933, a group of men wielding machine guns entered the Teamster District Council headquarters building at 637 South Ashland Avenue in Chicago at about 8:30 a.m. and held about 80 people hostage for 3 hours. The leader of the gunmen declared their purpose was to break the hold of Murray Humphreys, William O'Donnell, and Three-Finger Jack White on the Teamster unions. When the three gangsters did not appear as expected after 3 hours, the gunmen kidnapped Fred Sass, business agent of the Ashwagon Drivers Union, and Morris Goldberg, clerk for the Moving Van Drivers Union. Someone later communicated with Frank Goldberg, Morris's brother, and assured him Morris was uninjured. The gunmen held the two men over the weekend, apparently in the belief that Sass and Goldberg, who was O'Donnell's brother-in-law, knew where the three outfit members were. Sass and Goldberg repeatedly said they did not know. The duo was told to quit their union jobs or face assassination, and were released around dawn on Monday, May 1st. The Chicago Tribune initially declared that Roger Toohey himself led the kidnappers, but a few days later reported only that members of the Toohey gang had committed the kidnapping. According to one theory, the Toohey gang had seen revenues dry up with the repeal of Prohibition and were seeking to take over unions themselves as a way of generating income. Another theory was that the Toohey gang had been hired by the IBT, which was seeking to wrest back control of the district council. A third theory held that Roger Toohey was seeking to take over unions in an attempt to raise money to pay for the medical care of his brother Tommy, who had recently been partially paralyzed. Alvin Karpus, Fred Barker, and Fred's mother took up residence in St. Paul, Minnesota, in late December 1931. There, Alvin and Fred formed a new incarnation of the Barker-Karpus gang. Local gangster and casino owner Jack Pfeiffer put the Barker-Karpus gang up in a rented cottage in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, on the outskirts of St. Paul. Kidnapping had become a lucrative enterprise for American gangsters in the past year. The number of high-profile kidnappings reached 27 in 1933, more than double the number in 1932. It was safer than bank robbery, but just as lucrative. In early June 1933, Pfeiffer met with Barker-Karpus gang leaders and persuaded them to kidnap William Ham, Jr., president of the Ham's Brewing Company and heir to the Ham family fortune. The rationale for kidnapping Ham, Pfeiffer said, was the $100,000 ransom the gang could expect to collect. Some historians assert that the Barker-Karpus gang was manipulated into kidnapping Ham, so Toohey could be framed for the crime and eliminated as competition for the Chicago outfit. Sources vary widely as to who conceived of framing Toohey. It may have been outfit head Frank Nitti, but the idea may have come from Murray the Camel Humphreys, the outfit's chief fixer and labor racketeer. Tom Brown, the corrupt ex-chief of police of St. Paul, or Chicago Police Captain Daniel Gilbert, may also have conceived of the plot. Crime historian Jay Nash says the idea came jointly from Pfeiffer, Harry Sawyer, and Fred Goetz, a.k.a. George Shotgun Ziegler, a Chicago outfit assassin. Historian Julie A. Thompson, however, attributes it only to Pfeiffer. The Barker-Karpus gang kidnapped Ham shortly after 12:15 p.m. on June 15, 1933, as he walked from the brewery to his home in St. Paul. 4 men assisted Karpus and Barker in kidnapping Ham: Arthur Doc Barker, Fred's brother, Byron Bolton, Charles Old Fitzgerald, and Fred Goetz. Brown, still a detective with the St. Paul Police, kept the Barker Karpus gang apprised of the FBI and St. Paul Police investigations into the kidnapping. The Ham family paid the $100,000 ransom on June 17th, and Ham was freed at dawn on June 19th. Melvin Purvis was the FBI special agent in charge of the investigation into the Ham kidnapping. From the beginning, Purvis believed that the Toohey gang committed the kidnapping. Purvis may have convinced himself of this, but it is also documented that Captain Daniel Gilbert told Purvis that the Chicago police had information that Toohey was responsible. On June 30th, gangster and stock manipulator John Jake the Barber Factor disappeared. Factor was facing extradition to the United Kingdom for trial on charges of stock fraud. Factor conceived of the kidnapping as a way to avoid extradition, as American law enforcement and prosecutors would need to keep him in the U.S. as legal proceedings against the kidnappers went forward. The British consul in the United States declared the kidnapping a farce. Factor's disappearance was convenient for the outfit. Not only could police blame the Factor kidnapping on Toohey, but Factor, himself an affiliate of the Chicago outfit, could accuse Toohey as well. Captain Gilbert told Purvis that he was convinced Toohey was responsible. Gilbert publicly accused Toohey of engineering Factor's abduction on July 3rd and repeated the claim several times to the press. Gilbert later claimed that he had 25 law enforcement officers trying to find Roger Toohey in the days after Factor's kidnapping, but could not find him. Factor reappeared on July 12th, allegedly after payment of a $70,000 ransom. The same day, Gilbert's men arrested 2 members of the Irish Bosses gang for kidnapping Factor. Unconcerned about Gilbert's public statements, Toohey decided to go on a mid-July fishing trip in southern Wisconsin with fellow gangsters Edward Father Tom McFadden, Gustav Gloomy Gus Schaefer, and Willie Sharkey. While returning to Chicago on July 19th, Toohey's car skidded off the road in misty, rainy weather and struck a utility pole. He reported the accident and attempted to pay for the pole. However, police discovered some weapons in Toohey's vehicle and arrested the 4 on concealed weapons charges. FBI agent Melvin Purvis drove to Wisconsin and took Roger Toohey and his 3 associates to Minnesota without an extradition order. The FBI falsely claimed to have an ironclad case against Toohey. Taxicab driver Leo J. Allison failed to identify any of the 4 men as the person who paid him to take a ransom note to the Ham family. The 4 men were taken to Ham's brewery office in secret, and Ham failed to identify them as his kidnappers. Unable to link Toohey to the Factor kidnapping, the 4 men were sent back to Elkhorn to face weapons charges. Only then did Purvis claim he had 4 eyewitnesses connecting him and his men to the Ham kidnapping. Roger could have sought a writ of habeas corpus, as Purvis declined to provide the names of his eyewitnesses to a federal court. To discourage this, Purvis added a charge of conspiracy to kidnap and indicated he would keep adding charges to prevent any release of Toohey. With little evidence on which to hold the Irish boss, FBI agents beat him brutally and did not let him sleep in an attempt to wring a confession from him. The federal court scheduled a hearing on Roger's motion for summary judgment on August 14th. Federal agents made a series of wild and inaccurate claims which bolstered their case in public. The FBI said it had been investigating Toohey for 2 years already and had intensified their focus on him after enactment of the Federal Kidnapping Act on June 22, 1932. Federal law enforcement officials now claimed that he had kidnapped people in Kansas City, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, and also Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and had operated a vast kidnap ring operating across the entire Midwestern United States. The United States Department of Justice reiterated its claim that the case against Toohey was ironclad. FBI agents told the press that he was a callous killer, cruel by nature and devoid of any human attributes, driven by an insane desire for gangland power, which makes him absolutely ruthless and more deadly than a viper. They claimed he had a gang of more than 100 killers, a loosely knit band of the most notorious desperados in the country, most of them fugitives from justice. Toohey, they said, led a reign of terror and boasted that the law could not touch him. FBI agents also claimed that he was so vicious that even other gangsters called him America's menace. On August 8th, the Justice Department convened a federal grand jury to hear evidence regarding an indictment against Toohey and the other 3 men on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy to kidnap, and interstate transportation of a person held for ransom. Testifying before the grand jury were the arresting officers from Elkhorn, the Walworth County Sheriff, 3 Chicago police officers, and William Ham, among others. On August 12, 1933, all 4 men were indicted by a grand jury on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and interstate transportation. A grand jury indictment did not require that any accusatory evidence be revealed to the defendants or the court, quashing Toohey's habeas corpus effort. Roger Toohey and his co-defendants were among the first people to be prosecuted under the Federal Kidnapping Act. L.L. Drill, the United States District Attorney for St. Paul, now admitted the case against Toohey was thin at first, but he was fairly confident that now it had nothing lacking. Dissatisfied with Drill's preparation and handling of the case, United States Attorney General Homer Cummings replaced him with Special Assistant to the Attorney General Joseph B. Keenan. Keenan had successfully convicted George Machine Gun Kelly and 3 others for the kidnapping of oilman Charles F. Urschel, and his experience was believed to be critical to convicting Toohey. The FBI now developed evidence of Toohey's innocence. Alvin Karpus, Doc Barker, and George Fitzgerald had left their fingerprints on the ransom notes given to the Ham family. The FBI Technical and Research Laboratory, established in the fall of 1932, had only just developed a technique to lift fingerprints from paper. This technique was now used to lift the Karpus gang's prints from the ransom notes on September 6, 1933. Despite evidence of the involvement of the Barker-Karpus gang, law enforcement continued to press their case against Toohey, McFadden, Schaefer, and Sharkey. Toohey was indicted for leading a $234,000 mail robbery in Sacramento, California, in February 1933. Police in Nebraska believed, and Sharkey led a $51,000 bank robbery in Grand Island in 1932. Schaefer and Sharkey, along with Frank Blackie, M. Toohey and Sharkey led a $51,000 bank robbery in Grand Island in 1932. Schaefer and Sharkey, along with Frank Blackie McKee and Silent Jim Ryan, 2 other alleged members of the Toohey gang, were indicted for a mail robbery in Minneapolis in January 1933. Alleged Toohey associates Gene Thomas, a.k.a. Frank McGee, and George W. Red Kerr were indicted for participating in a $100,000 mail robbery in Milwaukee in January 1933. Judge Matthew M. Joyce of the United States District Court for the District of Minnesota presided over the Toohey trial. The lead prosecutor was Joseph B. Keenan. The 9 jurors were seated on November 9, 1933. Keenan's star witness was William Ham. Ham identified McFadden as one of his kidnappers on the trial's first day, and then recanted his testimony the next day. When asked by the prosecution to identify Willie Sharkey as one of his kidnappers, Ham could not do so. He was able to testify about a Wisconsin road sign he saw, which the prosecution said put the place of his imprisonment in Wisconsin. Keenan also called Daniel Rush to the stand, but Rush, who had seen the kidnapping from his home, was not able to identify any of the kidnappers. When pressed, Rush could only say that Sharkey resembled the driver of the kidnap car. Taxicab driver Leo Allison proved so reluctant to testify that Keenan had to ask the court for permission to treat Allison as a hostile witness. Only after extensive questioning did Allison admit that the man who'd given him the ransom note resembled McFadden. 2 other prosecution eyewitnesses, dentist Dr. Horace LaBissonniere and drugstore owner Clarence J. Thomas, also testified that Toohey resembled the man who left ransom note in Thomas's drugstore. Neither could not positively identify him. The prosecution had better luck from 2 other eyewitnesses, however. Printer Walter Bowick, who was in the drugstore when one of the Ham ransom notes was delivered, positively identified Toohey as the man who delivered the ransom note. Farmhand Charles Carlson positively identified Toohey, McFadden, and Schaefer as the men he saw loitering near the spot where the ransom money was left. Carlson stuck to his testimony despite strong defense cross-examination. Toward the end of the government's case, various law enforcement officers testified about the weapons found in the Toohey car, although none mentioned a pistol converted into a machine gun. Elkhorn police also testified about the kidnapping gear they found in the car, which included a sash, a pair of rubber boots, and some bandages. The prosecution rested on November 16th. Jake Factor arrived in Minneapolis during the trial at the request of federal prosecutors. He never took the witness stand. Factor did, however, give almost daily interviews with the press on the courthouse steps in which he accused Toohey of kidnapping and torturing him. The defense opened its case on November 17th. 3.5 days were spent reading into the record depositions from a wide range of individuals who claimed to have seen Toohey, McFadden, Schaefer, and Sharkey nowhere near Minneapolis during the Ham kidnapping. Defense attorney Thomas McMeekin attempted to introduce extensive evidence that Walter Bowick was an inveterate liar who had fled town after his prosecution testimony. Judge Joyce disallowed the evidence, arguing that it should have been raised during cross-examination. A defense effort to discredit Carlson on the grounds of witness coaching was rejected on the same grounds. Rogers' defense relied on an alibi for June 15 and 16. The alibi was provided in part by DePlain's lawyer Vincent Connor and his client Gus A. Palmquist. Both men said they met with Toohey on the night of June 16 when drugstore ransom note was delivered, and Connor said he'd telephoned Toohey at his home on June 15. Telephone records supported Connor's testimony. Connor and Edward J. Meany, a DePlain's realtor and insurance broker, also testified that they had met with Toohey in DePlain's on June 15. Local police arrested both Connor and Meany as they left the courtroom, claiming they had violated a local ordinance against registering in a hotel under an assumed name. Judge Joyce was outraged when he learned of it and freed both men. Toohey's co-defense attorney, William Scott Stewart, called the two men's imprisonment an old trick to intimidate defense witnesses. Gus Schaefer's defense also rested on an alibi. He claimed he was at a motel in King City, California, the week of the Ham kidnapping. In addition to depositions from the motel clerks, postcards postmarked sent by Schaefer to his wife from California and Wyoming on June 21st and 22nd were introduced as evidence as well. 2 handwriting experts testified that Schaefer had written the postcards. A prosecution attempt to impugn their testimony by comparing prison letters to the postcards failed when the experts pointed out the different writing instruments used. Toohey's wife, Clara, testified for the defense regarding certain kidnapping items found in his car. The sash cord was a clothesline rope her children used to play with, she said. The bandages were rags used to clean up the car when her children became carsick, and the rubber boots were hers. The defense rested on November 25th, declining to provide alibis for McFadden or Sharkey. The government had intended to recall William Ham to the stand as part of its rebuttal and have him identify his kidnappers by their voices alone, but never did so. The prosecution attempted to call Jake Factor to the stand, claiming Factor would identify the 4 men as his kidnappers. It also attempted to bring in a new witness, Richard Gustafson, to testify that he had seen Toohey and his men loitering about the Ham Brewery for 3 days prior to kidnapping. Judge Joyce denied both requests on the grounds that these witnesses should have been called during the prosecution's original case. The government then rested on November 25th. The jury was out for just 6.5 hours. On November 28th, the jury acquitted all 4 men of William Ham's kidnapping. On July 21, 1933, shortly after his arrest in Elkhorn, police secretly arranged for a lineup of Toohey, McFadden, Schaefer, and Sharkey and brought Jake Factor in to identify them as his kidnappers. He failed to recognize any of the men. Factor now told police that his kidnappers were demanding even more money or they would kidnap him again. Factor agreed to allow FBI agent Melvin Purvis to tap his telephone, and Purvis listened in on a number of the demands for more cash. Purvis told Factor to arrange for a new payment, and the FBI decided to set a trap for anyone who showed up at the ransom drop site. The ransom was delivered by 2 undercover police officers in St. Paul on August 15th. Basil the Owl Banghart and Martin Ice Wagon O'Connor showed up at the location. The 2 gangsters realized it was a trap and shot their way clear, even though more than 300 FBI and local law enforcement officers surrounded them and 2 law enforcement spotter planes circled overhead to track their getaway vehicle. Law enforcement continued to build their case against Toohey as the Ham kidnapping trial went forward. On September 15th, Chicago Police Captain Dan Gilbert claimed several eyewitnesses saw 3 members of the Toohey gang loitering about the Dells Roadhouse where Factor was kidnapped. On November 9th, a grand jury indicted Hugh Banghart, Charles Ice Wagon Connors, and August John Lamar for participating in the Factor kidnapping. Banghart was captured in Baltimore, Maryland on February 11th. Arrested with him was Isaac Costner. Immediately after Toohey's acquittal for the Ham kidnapping, federal authorities arrested him, McFadden, Schaefer, and Sharkey on charges of kidnapping Factor. Schaefer and Sharkey were also arrested for robbing the mail in Milwaukee in January 1933. Willie Sharkey, who had twice exhibited irrational behavior during the Ham trial, committed suicide by hanging on November 30th. Roger Toohey's trial in the kidnapping of Jake Factor opened on January 16, 1934. Thomas Courtney, Minnesota State's attorney prosecuting the case, convinced President Franklin D. Roosevelt to not deport Factor in the interest of law enforcement. The prosecution called 6 eyewitnesses who claimed they saw Toohey and his co-defendants kidnap Factor. Factor himself testified at the trial. Now claiming that his blindfold had slipped one day, he accused Roger of being his kidnapper. Under cross-examination, Factor was confronted with the fact that he'd failed to identify any of the 4 co-defendants in July 1933. Factor now claimed that he'd been told not to by captor Daniel Gilbert. Roger was able to provide an alibi for the night of Factor's kidnapping, with several neighbors testifying that he had sat on his front porch conversing. The jury deadlocked, and a mistrial was declared on February 2, 1934. A second trial began on February 13, 1934. Charges were inexplicably dropped against Connors, and charges against McFadden was dropped. Banghart and Costner were brought to Chicago to testify in the case. Costner turned state's evidence and completely corroborated Factor's accusations. Banghart testified for the defense. Banghart claimed that Jake Factor had recruited him and others to fake Factor's kidnapping as a way of helping Factor avoid deportation, and Banghart was paid $50,000 for his trouble. Factor and others then began framing Toohey and his gang for the kidnapping. A police officer who saw Factor minutes after he claimed to be freed claimed Factor was clean-shaven and his clothes in good appearance, even though Factor said he'd slept in his clothes for nearly 2 weeks and not been allowed to shower or shave. The press reported that the judge and jury giggled at Banghart's testimony, and that even Toohey's defense attorney hid a smile at how ridiculous it seemed. The jury convicted him and his co-defendants in just 4 hours, and deliberated the penalty for another 6. Deciding against death, the jury imposed a life sentence on all 3 men. They would be eligible for parole in 33 years. Basil Banghart was tried separately in the kidnapping of Jake Factor. He was convicted on March 13, 1934, and sentenced to 99 years in prison as well. The day he was convicted, Charles Connors was found murdered, allegedly by gangland thugs, in the Forest Preserve area of Cook County, Illinois. Toohey was incarcerated at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. On October 9, 1942, him and 6 other men escaped from Stateville Prison. After a month, he and the others were discovered living in a Chicago boarding house. Him and 3 others surrendered peacefully. The remaining 2 escapees tried to fight their way out and were killed. He re-entered Stateville on December 31, 1942, and was sentenced to an additional 199 years in prison for the escapes. He immediately filed an appeal. Over the next 8 years, he spent most of his bootlegger's fortune on legal fees. In 1944, 20th Century Fox released a semi-biographical and highly fictionalized film based on Toohey's life, titled Roger Toohey, Gangster. Roger successfully sued the studio for defamation of character. After 6 years, he won a judgment of $15,000, but Fox was able to distribute the film overseas without legal repercussions. On August 9, 1954, Federal District Court Judge John Barnes set Toohey free. The ruling was the culmination of an appeal he began in 1948. The court found that Captain Gilbert had induced Costner to perjure himself, that Gilbert had held back critical evidence of Roger's innocence, that Courtney, now a state circuit judge, had presumably had knowledge of Costner's perjury, that multiple Illinois state attorneys had engaged in other prosecutorial misconduct, and that it was now widely known that Factor's kidnapping had been faked. The state of Minnesota appealed the ruling, arguing that Toohey had not exhausted his state appeals before filing his federal appeal. He was released on August 10, 1954, but the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit ordered him returned to prison after just 48 hours of freedom while the appeal was pending. On August 30th, the Seventh Circuit declined Toohey's bid for habeas corpus, ruling he should remain in prison until the state's appeal was fully heard. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear Toohey's appeal on February 14, 1955, and did not accept his writ of habeas corpus. While the state's appeal was still pending, Governor William Stratton commuted his 2 sentences on July 31, 1957. Stratton reduced the 99-year sentence to 72 years and reduced the lifetime sentence to 3 years. Roger Toohey won parole on the kidnapping charge on February 20, 1958. Toohey's 3-year sentence for escape began running after his kidnapping parole. He was eligible for parole after serving a third of the sentence and was granted parole on November 12, 1959. He left Statesville Prison on November 24, 1959, having served exactly 25 years and 9 months. He lived with his sister Ethel Elysia at 125 North Lotus Avenue in Chicago. At 10:30 p.m. on December 16, 1959, Roger Toohey and Walter Miller, a retired Chicago police detective who served as his bodyguard, were gunned down as they entered the Elysia house. 2 or 3 men stepped out of shadows as Toohey and Miller mounted the steps to the front door. Miller identified himself as a police officer, and the men pulled 12-gauge shotguns from beneath their overcoats. Toohey was struck in the left leg above the knee and in the right leg below the knee. Miller was shot 3 times in the arms and legs. Miller was able to pull his revolver and fire 5 shots. Miller was taken to Loretto Hospital in critical condition. Toohey was taken to St. Anne's Hospital, where he died an hour later on the operating table from loss of blood. He received last rites a few minutes before he died. As he was moved into an oxygen tent, he told medical and police bystanders, "I've been expecting it. The bastards never forget." The d'Outremont brothers, Roy and Hugh d'Outremont, were a criminal gang based in the Pacific Northwest during the 1920s. Their unsuccessful robbery of a Southern Pacific Railroad express train and the murder of 4 crew members, known as the Siskiyou Massacre, was subject to one of the largest and most extensive investigations in the region. The brothers were eventually identified with the assistance of forensic scientist Edward Heinrich, and they were captured after a 4-year nationwide manhunt. Twin brothers Ray and Roy d'Outremont were born March 30, 1900, in Iowa, and their younger brother Hugh was born on February 21, 1904, in Arkansas. They were the sons of Paul d'Outremont, who was of French descent, and Isabella Bertha, née Wambacher, who was of German descent. Their father ran a barber shop in Albany, Oregon, and all 3 brothers worked as lumberjacks. Ray was involved in the emerging labor union movement and the Industrial Workers of the World during his youth. He was sent to a reformatory in Monroe, Washington in 1919 for his affiliation with the Industrial Workers of the World, and spent nearly a year there. When Hugh graduated from high school in New Mexico in June 1923, he joined his brothers in a logging camp near Silverton, Oregon. The express train was only a few miles from the Siskiyou station when they boarded the train, waiting for the steam locomotive number 3626 to arrive. Roy and Hugh climbed aboard the locomotive tender and forced the engineer Sidney Bates to stop the train while most of it was still inside the 3,000-foot tunnel. Number 13, Ray, waited on the ground near the tunnel portal with the dynamite. The brothers were armed with sawed-off shotguns, and while Roy watched the engineer, Ray and Hugh went ahead to the baggage mail car, which they thought was carrying an estimated $40,000. When Postal Clerk Elvin Doherty saw the two approach the mail car, he closed the door and Hugh fired his shotgun twice. Ray then attached a dynamite charge with all of the dynamite they had stolen, to the mail car's door and ran for cover with his brothers. Roy d'Autremont described what happened in a sworn statement years later. The brothers were then forced to flee empty-handed, while a second conductor ran to a nearby emergency phone and reported the robbery to authorities in Ashland, Oregon. The bodies of the 4 victims were found at the scene of the crime. Engineer Bates and fireman Marvin Seng were beside the engine cab. Each had been shot in the head. Train passenger railroad brakeman Coyle O. Johnson was shot 4 times in the stomach and died from his wounds. The charred body of mail clerk Doherty was in the mail car. Police investigators later found a detonator and a discarded .45 caliber pistol at the scene, along with 3 gunny sacks which had been soaked in creosote and dragged along the ground to throw bloodhounds off their trail. The search party fanned out from Tunnel 13 and discovered a black traveling bag with a railroad shipping tag and a pair of green overalls. Over a dozen suspects were jailed and questioned, but local authorities made little headway in solving the case. Dr. Edward Heinrich, a chemistry professor at the University of California, was brought in and was able to use early forensic methods to accurately provide a description of the suspects for police. Upon examining the green overalls found by investigators, Heinrich reported that the suspect was a left-handed lumberjack, approximately 25 years old, with brown hair and fair complexion, was 5'8" in height, and weighed 165 pounds, and was described as a man with fastidious habits. He further explained his findings were based on specific evidence gathered by his investigation of the overalls, which included strands of hair and the presence of Douglas fir needles and fresh pitch from pine trees. The overalls were worn only on the right side, suggesting the same position a left-hander would take if he were to lean against a tree while swinging an axe. The suspect's height and weight were estimated from the size of the overalls, and the fastidious habits were evidenced by some neatly cut fingernail clippings found in the pocket. In addition, the receipt for a registered letter was found in the pocket, which police later traced to a $50 money order sent by Roy d'Autremont to his brother Hugh in Lakewood, New Mexico, on September 14, 1923. Investigators then questioned Paul d'Autremont, who confirmed that all 3 sons were lumberjacks and that Roy was left-handed. The .45 Colt weapon found at the crime scene was traced to William Elliott, whose handwriting matched that of Roy d'Autremont, and the railroad express tags found on the suitcase revealed that Roy had mailed it to himself from Eugene to Portland on January 21st of that year. Although there was enough evidence to identify the d'Autremont brothers as the most likely suspects, apprehending them was another matter. All 3 had disappeared since the incident. The federal government offered a $6,000 reward for their capture, with another $7,000 added by Southern Pacific and $900 from the Railway Express Company. News of the Siskiyou massacre had attracted national attention by this time, and investigators received reports of numerous sightings, followed every one of these new leads. None of these leads ever panned out. The government eventually issued over 2 million wanted posters printed in English and 5 other languages, which were then distributed internationally. After several months with no new leads, investigators were on the verge of giving up. However, a corporal named Thomas Reynolds came forward and identified Hugh d'Autremont as James Price, who had been an acquaintance of his while serving with the United States Army in the Philippines. He had only recently been stationed on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco, California, when he recognized d'Autremont from a wanted poster and reported this to his superior officers. Hugh d'Autremont was arrested within 6 hours, and while admitting his true identity in custody, he was able to stall his extradition to the United States until March 1927. Once back in the United States, Hugh d'Autremont was tried and convicted of first-degree murder. Hugh d'Autremont denied knowledge of his brother's whereabouts, but his capture encouraged federal authorities to redistribute new wanted posters. Within 2 months, a report was received that Ray and Roy d'Autremont had been seen in Portsmouth, Ohio, and were discovered to be living in nearby Steubenville under the assumed names of Clarence and Elmer Goodwin. They were arrested by FBI agents on June 8, 1927, and offered no resistance. The twin brothers later claimed they had fled to Detroit after the robbery. Ray had married while in Detroit and moved to Hanging Rock, with his brother following him several months later. They kept on the move, living in both Portsmouth and Steubenville, before they were recognized when the new wanted posters were issued. Ray had previously bleached his hair, but this failed to disguise him. The two were quickly extradited to Jackson County, Oregon, where they stood trial for their role in the Siskiyou massacre. Their arrival coincided with Hugh's murder trial, although this fact was withheld from the defendant. Hugh was convicted of first-degree murder, even though jurors recommended leniency, and Roy and Ray d'Autremont both pleaded guilty to the same charges. All three were sentenced to life imprisonment at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. Hugh d'Autremont was paroled in 1958. He moved to San Francisco, where he worked as a printer. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer 3 months after his release and died on March 30th, 1959. Roy d'Autremont was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1949 and was transferred to the Oregon State Hospital in Salem. He later underwent a frontal lobotomy, which left him unable to care for himself. In 1979, he was transferred to a Salem nursing home where he received 24-hour care. Roy was granted parole in March 1983. He died at the nursing home where he had resided since 1979 on June 17, 1983, at the age of 83. Ray d'Autremont was the last of the brothers to be released from prison on October 27, 1961. He was questioned by reporters while leaving the prison, and when asked how it felt to be released, he replied, "I'm trying to think of something to say." Well, you can imagine how it feels, can't you? But one thing is for sure. For the rest of my life, I will struggle with the question of whatever possessed us to do such a thing. After his release, Ray lived in Eugene, Oregon, where he worked as a janitor on the weekends at the University of Oregon. He also spent his time painting and studying French and Spanish. In 1972, then-Governor Tom McCall commuted Ray's sentence after he requested to be a free man before I die. Ray d'Autremont died in a Eugene nursing home on December 20, 1984, at the age of 84.